Hello and welcome back to the Midnight Historian. In the last gray hour before dawn, on a morning somewhere around 5,000 years ago, a farmer stood alone on the eastern bank of a great river and watched the water rise. He had been coming down to this same spot every morning for days, as his father had done before him, and his father's father before that, because the season had turned, and the whole world he knew was waiting for one single thing to happen. And now, at last, it was happening. The river, which for months had shrunk down into a sluggish brown ribbon winding between cracked mud banks, was swelling. It was creeping up over the baked earth, spreading out across the fields in a slow, patient silver sheet, carrying with it a load of dark silt washed down from mountains so far away that no one he had ever met had ever seen them, or ever would. He did not know where the water came from. Nobody in his entire civilization, for the next 3,000 years, would ever really know where the water came from. He only knew that it had come again, that the fields would be fed, that his children would eat this year, and that the world, for one more season, had kept its promise. His name was never written down. No monument remembers him, no tomb preserves him, no story carries even a fragment of who he was. And yet everything in the story you are about to hear, every pyramid, every golden mask, every god and queen and boy king, every temple whose columns still stand today against the desert sky, rests entirely on the shoulders of that one anonymous man and the millions like him, standing on the mud in the early light, watching the river rise. This is the story of ancient Egypt, and before we go any further, it is worth pausing to take in the sheer, almost absurd scale of what those words actually mean. When we talk about ancient Egypt, we are not talking about a kingdom that flourished for a century or two and then faded, the way most empires in this world have done. We are talking about a civilization that endured, in a recognizable and continuous form, for more than 3,000 years. 3,000 years. The stretch of time separating the first pharaoh from the last is longer than the stretch of time separating the last pharaoh from us. Cleopatra, the famous queen whose story will close this long night's tale, lived closer in time to the moon landing than she did to the building of the Great Pyramid. When she looked out at those monuments on the Giza Plateau, she was looking at structures already more ancient and mysterious to her than her own ruined world is to you and me tonight. That is the kind of time we are dealing with. It is time deep enough to get lost in, deep enough to sink into, and that, if you are listening to this in the dark with your eyes growing heavy, is exactly what I am inviting you to do. Before we drift down the river together, take a quiet moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you feel like it, leave your location and your local time down in the comments. It helps other restless, sleepless people find their way to this little corner of the night. And there is something pleasant about knowing that somewhere far away, a stranger is settling under the same dark sky, listening to the same slow story. So get comfortable. Let your shoulders sink into the bed, and let yourself ease into the tale of the oldest great civilization on Earth, the gift of a river, the rise and fall and rise again of the people who lived beside it, and the strange, patient way their world was lost to memory for more than 1,000 years, and then, almost by accident, found again. The gift of the river. To understand anything at all about Egypt, we cannot start with kings or pyramids or gods. We have to start with geography, because Egypt, more than perhaps any other civilization that has ever existed, was the direct and total creation of a single feature of the natural world. A Greek historian named Herodotus, visiting the country many centuries after its greatest ages had already passed, wrote a line that has been quoted ever since, that Egypt was the gift of the Nile, and for once the famous quote is not an exaggeration but a plain statement of fact. Take away the river, and there is no Egypt. There is only the eastern edge of the Sahara, one of the driest and most lifeless places on the entire planet, a landscape of rock and sand where rain might not fall for years at a stretch, and where nothing that matters to human beings can grow at all. Through the middle of that dead world, running south to north for hundreds of miles, flows a single, improbable ribbon of water, and along its banks, in a strip of fertile ground sometimes only a few miles wide. An entire civilization assembled itself and stayed assembled for longer than almost anything else human beings have ever built. The Egyptians themselves understood this with perfect clarity, and they built the understanding directly into their language. They called their country Kemet, which means the Black Land, named for the dark, rich, almost greasy silt that the rivers spread across the fields each year, soil so fertile that farmers in most other parts of the ancient world would have regarded it as something close to magic. And they called the desert that pressed in on either side Deshret, the Red Land, a place of danger and death and chaos, the domain of hostile gods and restless spirits, a place you did not go unless you had very good reason. The border between the two was not vague or gradual, the way borders between landscapes usually are. It was, and still is today, astonishingly sharp. There are places in Egypt where you can stand with one foot on black, moist, cultivated earth and the other foot on dead red sand, the line between the living world and the dead one drawn as cleanly as if someone had marked it with a ruler. The Egyptians lived their entire lives along that line, life on one side, death on the other, and it is genuinely difficult to overstate how deeply that daily, visible, physical boundary between the two shaped everything they ever believed about the world, and about what happens to us when we leave it. And then there was the flood itself, the annual miracle around which the whole of Egyptian existence was arranged. Every year, in late summer, fed by monsoon rains falling on the highlands of Ethiopia far to the south, rains no Egyptian ever saw or knew anything about, the Nile would swell and rise and spill gently over its banks, covering the fields of the valley in a shallow sheet of water that stood for weeks before slowly draining away, leaving behind a fresh layer of that black, fertile silt. This was not a flood in the sense that word usually carries, not a disaster, not a rampage. It was slow, predictable, and gentle, more like a tide than a catastrophe, and the entire Egyptian calendar was built around it. The year had 3 seasons: the inundation, when the water covered the fields and farm work largely stopped; the emergence, when the water receded and planting began in the soft new soil; and the harvest, when the grain came in and the whole cycle prepared to begin again. Year after year, century after century, millennium after millennium, the river kept its rhythm. And here is the thing worth holding on to, because it explains so much of what is to come. The Egyptians were shaped, at the deepest level of their collective mind, by the experience of living inside a world that was reliable. The sun rose every day out of the desert on one side and set every day into the desert on the other. The river rose every year, within a few weeks of the same date, and fed everyone. The Egyptians looked at this endlessly repeating, endlessly dependable universe and concluded, reasonably enough, that the natural state of the world was order, harmony, and permanence, and that the highest duty of every human being, from the mightiest king down to our nameless farmer on the riverbank, was to keep that order going. They had a word for this idea, Mat, which meant truth and justice and balance and rightness, all folded into one. And if you remember only one Egyptian word from this entire long night, let it be that one. Because Mat is the quiet thread running underneath absolutely everything in this story, every temple, every law, every burial, every king. The world was in balance. The job of Egypt was to keep it that way. There was one more gift the geography gave, and it is easy to miss, though its consequences ran through the whole of Egyptian history. The same deserts that pressed so close on either side of the valley, deadly and empty, were also walls. To the east and west stretched hundreds of miles of sand and rock that no army could easily cross. To the north lay the sea, and to the south the river itself broke into a series of rocky rapids, called cataracts, that made invasion from that direction slow and difficult. Egypt, almost alone among the great civilizations of the ancient world, grew up in something close to safety, protected on every side by barriers it had done nothing to build, while the peoples of Mesopotamia, over in the valley of the Tigris and Euphrates, lived in a state of more or less constant warfare, their open plains inviting invasion after invasion, their cities rising and burning and rising again. Egypt was left, for enormous stretches of its history, almost entirely alone. That isolation bought the Egyptians something very few peoples in history have ever had, which is time. Time to develop slowly, time to settle into their own habits and beliefs and perfect them over generations. Time to become, and then to remain, unmistakably themselves. It also, in the very long run, would cost them, because a civilization that grows up without serious rivals does not learn the hard, flexible lessons that rivals teach. And there would come a day, far in the future of our story, when the walls of sand would no longer be enough. But that day was a very long way off. For now, in the deep morning of the world, the valley was safe, the river was rising, and something remarkable was beginning to stir along its banks. Before the pharaohs. It is tempting to imagine that Egyptian civilization simply appeared, fully formed, pyramids and hieroglyphs and golden kings all arriving together in some single burst of brilliance. And to be fair, the Egyptians themselves rather encouraged this view, tracing their kingship back to a mythical age when the gods themselves had ruled the valley in person. The truth, as the truth usually is, was slower, humbler, and in its own quiet way, more remarkable. Long before there was an Egypt, there were simply people, and for thousands of years they did not even live along the river at all, or at least not only there. This is one of the genuine surprises that modern archaeology has handed us, that the Sahara itself, in the millennia before our story begins, was not yet the absolute desert it is today. It was a dry grassland, dotted with seasonal lakes and watering holes, and across it moved bands of cattle herders, following the grazing, leaving behind rock paintings of their animals in places where today nothing lives at all. Paintings of cattle and swimmers and hunters out in the middle of what is now some of the most lifeless terrain on Earth. Slowly, over centuries, the climate shifted. The rains failed, the grasslands withered, the lakes dried one by one, and the people who had lived on them were pushed, generation by generation, toward the one source of water that never failed. The Sahara dried out, and its people walked down into the valley of the Nile and stayed. Egypt, you could say without stretching the truth very far, was founded by climate refugees, and there is something worth sitting with in that thought, that one of the most stable and enduring civilizations in human history began with people abandoning a homeland that was dying underneath them. Down in the valley, through the long centuries that historians call the pre-dynastic period, the pieces of what would become Egypt were assembling themselves one by one, in villages of mud brick whose remains are so modest that it took archaeologists a very long time to realize how much was happening inside them. Farming arrived, wheat and barley, sheep and goats and cattle, and with farming came storage, and with storage came the oldest problem in the world, which is that once a community has a granary, someone has to decide how its contents are shared, and someone has to defend it, and someone, sooner or later, gets to be in charge. The villages grew into towns. The towns began to trade with one another up and down the river, which was itself a kind of second gift, because the Nile flows north while the prevailing wind in Egypt blows south, meaning a boat could drift downstream with the current and then simply raise a sail to come home again. The river was not just a source of food. It was a highway running the entire length of the country, and it knit the valley's scattered communities together into a single connected world in a way that no other ancient land quite experienced. Pottery styles spread, burial customs spread, and in the graves of this deep era, thousands of years before a single pyramid, we can already see, unmistakably, the first stirrings of the great Egyptian obsession. Even the poorest people were buried with care, laid on their sides in the sand, facing the setting sun, with a few pots of food and drink beside them for a journey that everyone already seemed to agree was coming. The dry desert sand, as it happens, preserved some of these earliest burials naturally, drying the bodies into a leathery permanence. And more than one historian has wondered whether the Egyptians' famous conviction that the body must survive for the soul to live on began right here, with ordinary families digging in the sand and finding that their grandparents were, in some strange way, still there. By the last centuries before 3100 BC, the valley was no longer a world of villages. It had consolidated, through processes we can only partly reconstruct, into a small number of rival kingdoms, and eventually into two great ones, a kingdom of Upper Egypt in the south, in the narrow valley, and a kingdom of Lower Egypt in the north, in the broad, marshy delta where the river fans out to meet the sea. It is worth pausing on the names because they confuse everyone at first, and the confusion is nobody's fault. Upper Egypt is the south, and Lower Egypt is the north, because the terms follow the river, which flows from the highlands of Africa down toward the Mediterranean. The Egyptians always thought of their country this way, as two lands, distinct in character, the narrow valley and the wide delta. And long after the two had been joined together, they went on calling their united country the Two Lands, and their kings wore a double crown. The white crown of the south nested inside the red crown of the north, a piece of political symbolism repeated so faithfully for the next 3,000 years that we can read it today on monuments separated by more than 2 millennia. The joining itself, the moment Egypt as we know it begins, sits right on the edge of history, half in the light and half in the dark, and it comes down to us attached to a single name, Narmer. In one of the world's great museums in Cairo, there is a flat slab of dark green stone, about the size of a serving dish, carved on both sides with scenes in delicate relief, and it is not too much to call it one of the most important single objects ever pulled out of the ground. It is known as the Narmer Palette, and on one side it shows a king wearing the white crown of Upper Egypt, his arm raised, about to strike down a defeated enemy, while on the other side the same king, now wearing the red crown of Lower Egypt, walks in procession past the bodies of the slain. One king, both crowns. Whoever carved that palette, somewhere around 3100 BC, was announcing something enormous, that the two lands now had a single master, and Egyptian tradition itself remembered a first king who joined the country together, calling him Menes, a name that may well be another name for this same Narmer, though historians have argued the point back and forth for well over a century, and the honest answer is that we cannot be entirely sure. What we can be sure of is that around this time, the valley and the delta became one kingdom, that the kings of this new united Egypt founded a capital city near the exact point where the two lands met, a city later ages would call Memphis, planted like a pin at the balance point of the country, and that the line of rulers descending from this moment would continue, dynasty after dynasty, with interruptions but never with a full stop, for the next 3,000 years. It is also worth being honest about what the palette probably is not, which is a photograph. Whether Narmer truly conquered the north in a single dramatic war, or whether the palette celebrates and simplifies a slower joining that had taken generations of marriage, trade, and quiet pressure, is genuinely unknown. And more than one scholar suspects the unification was less a single thunderclap, and more a long negotiation that later kings preferred to remember as a victory. Ancient kings, it turns out, were not so very different from modern governments in this respect. The story a state tells about its own founding is usually tidier than the founding itself. One small housekeeping note belongs here because you will hear me speak all night of dynasties, the first dynasty, the fourth, the 18th, and it is fair to wonder where these numbers come from. They come, rather wonderfully, from an Egyptian himself, a priest named Manetho, who lived at the very end of our story, in the age after Alexander the Great, and who wrote a history of his own ancient country in Greek, organizing the long parade of kings into 30 ruling families. His actual book is lost, surviving only in quotations copied by later writers, some of whom were careless and some of whom were quarreling with each other. And yet his framework proves so useful that historians have never let go of it. There is something quietly moving in that, I think. The scaffolding on which all of Egyptian history still hangs was built by one of the last Egyptians, looking back down the corridor of his own civilization's 3,000 years, trying to put his ancestors in order before the memory of them slipped away entirely. the invention of forever. The first dynasties of the United Kingdom, the centuries historians call the early dynastic period, are a strange and shadowy stretch of time, and it would be dishonest to pretend we can see them clearly. The kings of this age were buried far in the south, at a place called Abydos, in tombs of mud bricks sunk beneath the desert, and around several of the earliest of those tombs archaeologists found something that stops most people short when they first hear of it. Rows of subsidiary graves, dozens of them, sometimes hundreds, arranged neatly around the king's own burial, holding the bodies of servants, officials, craftsmen, even dwarfs and dogs, all of whom appear to have been buried at more or less the same time as their master. The uncomfortable conclusion, which most Egyptologists now accept, though the evidence is circumstantial and the debate has never fully closed, is that in these very earliest generations of Egyptian kingship, when a king died, some portion of his household went into the ground with him, whether by poison or some gentler means we cannot say, so that he would be as well served in the next world as he had been in this one. It is a dark note to strike so early in our story, and I will not linger on it, but it deserves its place, because of what happened next. Within a few generations, the practice stopped, completely. For the remaining 2,900 years of Egyptian civilization, no king ever again took his servants with him into death. Instead, the Egyptians invented a substitute, small carved figurines of servants and bakers and brewers, placed in the tomb to do the work of the next world by magic, and later painted scenes on tomb walls showing whole estates of laborers at their tasks, images that were believed to become real in the world beyond. Think about what that exchange actually means. Somewhere in the courts of the early dynasties, a decision was made, or an understanding slowly formed, that a picture of a servant would serve the king just as well as a dead one. It may be the single most humane bargain ever struck by a religion, and it tells you something important about the Egyptians that will hold true all the way down the centuries of this story. They were, by the standards of the ancient world, and the ancient world sets a low bar, not a notably cruel people. Their imagination ran toward order, provision, and continuation, not toward blood. And once they had convinced themselves that magic and art could do a thing, they were content to let magic and art do it. And that brings us to the tool that made all the magic durable, because it was in these same early centuries that Egypt perfected the invention on which everything else would rest: writing. The Egyptians did not necessarily invent writing first. The scribes of Mesopotamia have a competing and probably slightly older claim, and scholars enjoy arguing about it. But the Egyptians made writing their own in a way no one else quite did, and they wrapped it in a beauty that no other script in human history has ever matched. You know the script I mean. Hieroglyphs, the little pictures, the owls and reeds and open hands and seated figures, carved in crisp rows on temple walls and painted in color inside tombs. It is worth clearing away, right at the start, the most common misunderstanding about them, because it is the same misunderstanding that would one day delay their decipherment by centuries. Hieroglyphs are not simple picture writing, where a drawing of an owl means an owl. They are a true script, a mixture of signs standing for sounds and signs standing for ideas, capable of recording anything the spoken language could say: poetry, contracts, prayers, jokes, tax assessments, love songs. The owl, for what it is worth, is simply the sound of the letter EM. Alongside the formal hieroglyphs, which were always something of a display script, the ceremonial best handwriting of the civilization, the Egyptians developed a faster, flowing, joined-up version called hieratic for everyday use. Scribbled in ink on sheets of papyrus, the flattened reed paper that was itself one of Egypt's great gifts to the world. And it was in hieratic, on papyrus, that the actual daily business of the country ran for 3,000 years. We should be honest about what the earliest writing was actually for, because it was not poetry. The oldest written records of Egypt are labels, lists, and accounts, tags on jars of oil, tallies of grain, names and quantities, and years. Writing was born as an instrument of administration, a way for the new state to count what it had and where it was and who owed what. And that unglamorous origin points at the deeper truth of what made Egypt work. Beneath the golden surface of every pharaoh's reign, holding the entire enormous structure up, was an army of scribes, thousands upon thousands of trained, literate officials, measuring fields after each flood, assessing harvests, collecting taxes in grain, recording everything, reporting up a chain of command that ran from the smallest village all the way to the palace. Egypt was, among all its other distinctions, the first great bureaucratic state in human history, and the Egyptians themselves were entirely unembarrassed about it. Boys who could get a place in scribal school, and it was mostly boys, though not quite always, spent years copying exercises and being caned for laziness. And among the exercises they copied were compositions in praise of their own future profession, cheerful propaganda pieces in which a teacher walks his student through every other trade in the country, the metalworker stinking of fish eggs, the potter grubbing in mud, the soldier marching to exhaustion, the farmer worn down by worms and tax collectors, before delivering the moral, which is that the scribe sits in clean linen in the shade and writes, and is beaten by no one, and everything is better than everything else if only you can write. It is a joke, and it was meant as a joke, and it is also entirely sincere, and 40 centuries later, it remains perhaps the most honest advertisement for literacy ever composed. Be a scribe, the texts say. The scribe's body is soft, his hands are clean, and his name endures. And on that last point at least, they were telling the plain truth, because the names of ordinary scribes have in fact endured, on their statues and their palettes and their copybooks, while the names of the strong men who beat them have gone into the sand. The first genius we can name. It is one of the sadder facts of ancient history that almost everyone in it is anonymous. The people who built and painted and invented, with only the rarest exceptions, left no names, and the credit for their work was absorbed, as a matter of course, by the kings they served. Which is what makes the man we come to now so remarkable, because he is the exception, the first person in recorded history to be individually remembered for the thing we would now call genius. His name was Imhotep, and he served a king of the third dynasty named Djoser, somewhere around 2650 BC, holding a stack of titles that included high priest, chief sculptor, and overseer of works. Something like a combination of prime minister, chief physician, and royal architect. Before Imhotep, kings of Egypt were buried beneath structures called mastabas, low, flat, rectangular platforms of mud brick raised over an underground burial chamber, dignified enough but modest, and made of a material that the centuries eat. Imhotep appears to have looked at the traditional royal mastaba and had two ideas, either of which alone would have earned him his place in this story. The first was to build in stone, quarried, dressed, permanent stone, on a scale no human being had ever attempted, so that the king's monument would not merely outlast his mourners, but outlast, as far as anyone could tell, the world itself. The second idea was to stack. He built a stone mastaba, and then set a smaller one on top of it, and a smaller one on top of that, 6 levels in all, rising in great steps nearly 200 feet above the desert at Saqqara, within sight of the capital at Memphis, a mountain made by hands, visible for miles up and down the valley, the like of which no one on earth had ever seen. We call it the Step Pyramid, and it still stands, the oldest large stone building on the planet, closing in now on its 5,000th birthday. Around it, Imhotep raised an entire enclosure of courts and shrines and facades. And here he did something touching that architects have noticed ever since, which is that, working in a material no one had ever really worked before, he made the stone imitate the older, softer world he knew, carving the columns to look like bundles of reeds, shaping the ceilings to look like palm logs, as if the new eternal material needed to be reassured by the forms of the mud brick and plant world it was replacing. The Egyptians never forgot him. His name was carved on the pedestal of Djoser's own statue, an almost unheard of honor, and over the following centuries his reputation grew rather than faded. First as the patron sage of scribes, who would pour out a drop of water in his memory before writing, and eventually, more than 2,000 years after his death, as a full god of healing and wisdom, with temples of his own. Sit with that for a moment, because it is not a thing that happens often in human history. A commoner, an official, a man with a job, remembered so long and so warmly that his civilization eventually promoted him into its pantheon. If you have ever doubted whether one person's work can outlive them, Imhotep is the standing stone answer, the learning curve. Great inventions rarely arrive finished, and the pyramid was no exception. Between the step pyramid of Djoser and the perfect smooth-sided monuments everyone pictures at the word Egypt, there lies a period of trial, error, and one genuinely alarming failure. And the story of that learning curve is mostly the story of one king, a ruler of the early 4th dynasty named Sneferu, who reigned around 2600 BC and who holds a record that will never be broken, having moved more stone than any other human being who has ever lived. Sneferu built not one great pyramid, but 3, and the 3 of them together, read in order, are a textbook written in millions of tons of limestone, a record of a civilization teaching itself, in real time, how to do the most ambitious thing anyone had yet attempted. His first pyramid, at a place called Medum, began as a step design in the tradition of Imhotep, and was then modified, apparently in pursuit of a new idea, the true pyramid, with smooth, straight, continuous sides rising to a point, a pure geometric form, a ramp of stone for the king's soul to ascend into the sky. The casing added at Medum to smooth the steps did not hold. Today, the monument stands as a strange, stark tower rising out of a collapsed skirt of rubble. And while archaeologists still debate exactly when the outer layers fell, whether during construction or centuries later, the lesson the ancient builders drew seems clear enough from what they did next. Sneferu's second pyramid, at Dashur, was begun boldly, its sides climbing at a steep, confident angle, and about halfway up, something changed. The angle of the walls abruptly softens, bending inward to a much gentler slope, giving the whole monument a strange, apologetic, stooped profile, and it has been known ever since, with a bluntness historians rarely manage, as the bent pyramid. Cracks had appeared. The ground beneath, or the steepness of the design, or both, had begun to fail, and the builders, rather than abandon years of work, finished the pyramid at a safer angle, leaving standing in the desert what remains the most honest monument in Egypt, a 50-million-ton confession that says, in effect, we were learning. And then, having learned, Sneferu simply started again. A mile away, he raised a third pyramid, designed from its first course at the gentler, proven angle, and this one rose without a hitch, clean and sound and enormous, the first true smooth-sided pyramid ever completed. It is called the Red Pyramid, for the warm color of its core stone, and the king was in all likelihood buried inside it, though, as with so much in this story, the burial itself has never been found. I want to pause here because it is easy to let these engineering details slide past as trivia, and they are not trivia. What the 3 pyramids of Sneferu record is a thing we almost never get to see in the ancient world, which is process, failure, adjustment, and mastery, in that order, written at full scale in stone. The Egyptians who built the wonders we are about to meet were not sorcerers, and they were not visited by anyone from anywhere. They were engineers, standing on a foundation of their own recent mistakes, and every perfect monument in the rest of this story stands on the bent shoulders of the experiments at Medum and Dashur. There is a lesson folded in there somewhere about every human accomplishment, and it is the kind of lesson best absorbed, I think, in the drowsy hours, without being spelled out too loudly. Nothing begins perfect. Not even the pyramids began perfect. It is worth adding, before we climb toward the most famous monuments of all, a word about Sneferu himself, because tradition remembered him in a way that cuts pleasantly against the grain of what we expect from god-kings. In later Egyptian stories, told and retold for centuries, Sneferu appears as the good-natured king, approachable, cheerful, a ruler who calls his advisors by friendly names and wanders his palace bored, looking for amusement, in one famous tale ordering his boat rowed across a palace lake by the young women of his court, and then halting the entire excursion with royal patience to help one of the rowers who had lost a hair ornament overboard because she, quite reasonably, wanted her own ornament back and not a replacement. Whether any of it is true is beyond knowing. The stories were written down centuries after his death, but the flavor of the memory matters. The king who moved more stone than anyone in history came down through his own people's folklore not as a tyrant, but as something like a benevolent, slightly restless uncle. And his was the name later scribes reached for when they wanted to conjure the good old days. Hold that gentleness in mind as we walk toward Giza, because his son, by contrast, would be remembered very differently, and the contrast between the two reputations, fair or not, is itself one of the oldest surviving pieces of public opinion in the world. The rope stretchers and the shape of the year. Before we climb toward the greatest monument of all, we should pause and ask a question that the monuments themselves quietly raise, which is how, exactly, a civilization with no iron, no pulley, no wheel to speak of in its early centuries, and no mathematics beyond what could be scratched on a flake of limestone, managed to know so precisely where things were, how big they were, and when things would happen. Because the pyramids are, before they are anything else, acts of measurement. And the measuring came first, and the measuring is a story of its own. It begins, like everything in Egypt, with the flood, and with a problem the flood created every single year, which is that when the water withdrew, the field boundaries had gone with it, the markers buried, the ditches silted, the landscape wiped smooth as a slate, and a farmer's whole livelihood and the state's whole tax assessment depended on redrawing, quickly and fairly, lines that had ceased to exist. The answer was a profession the men Egyptian texts and tomb paintings call the rope stretchers, teams of surveyors who walked out onto the drying mud with knotted cords, ropes marked off at even intervals, and remeasured the country, field by field, from fixed reference points on the high ground, and the paintings show them at it. The rope taut between them, the scribe alongside writing down the areas, and behind this annual, muddy, entirely practical ritual stands a thought so large it is easy to walk past, that geometry, the word itself, is Greek for earth measurement. And the Greeks who coined the word said plainly, and Herodotus among them, that the art had come to them from Egypt, born not in any academy, but in the mud of the receding Nile, invented by men in kilts with wet ropes, redrawing the world every autumn because the river had erased it. And if the story is tidier than the full truth, as such stories usually are, the kernel is sound, and it means that every schoolchild who has ever sweated over a triangle is, at the end of a very long chain, doing flood recovery work for a pharaoh. What the rope stretchers did for land, the scribes did for number, and we know their mathematics intimately, from surviving instructional papyri, and the greatest of them, a scroll copied out around 1550 BC by a scribe named Ahmes from an older original, and known today by the dull custom of naming treasures after their modern purchasers as the Rind Papyrus, is nothing less than a mathematics textbook, 87 worked problems with solutions, and its charm, for the sleepy listener, is that the problems are not abstract. They are Egypt in miniature, how to divide 7 loaves among 10 men, how to reckon the strength of beer against the grain that went into it, how many bricks for a ramp of such and such dimensions, how much feed for a stable of geese, and, in a sequence of problems that would have been read with professional interest a few miles from where the copyist sat, how to compute the slope of a pyramid, which the Egyptians expressed with perfect practicality as the horizontal setback per cubit of rise. The very number of foremen on a rising course of masonry would need to check with a plumb line and a measuring rod that the angle his gang was building matched the angle the architect had decreed. The arithmetic beneath these problems was strange by our habits, built almost entirely on doubling and on fractions whose numerator was always 1, so that an Egyptian scribe expressed what we would call 2/3 or 3/4 as elegant chains of halves and thirds and twelfths, and mathematicians who study the system report, with some surprise, that it works, that it is supple and quick in trained hands, and that the training is the point, because the papyrus opens with a title in the grand manner, promising accurate reckoning, the entrance into knowledge of all existing things and all obscure secrets, which is a large claim for a book of word problems about loaves, and is also, if you think about it, simply true, since the state that could divide 7 loaves among 10 men without a quarrel, 10,000 times a day, every day, for 3,000 years, was the state, and the obscure secret of all existing things, or at least of all existing granaries, really was written in those little chains of fractions. And what the scribes did for number, the priests did for time. And here the Egyptians made one of the quietest large discoveries in the history of the species. Every ancient people watched the moon, because the moon is easy, a clock in the sky that anyone can read, and lunar calendars with their drifting, wandering months are humanity's default. The Egyptians watched something harder and better. They noticed, at some point deep in the age before the pyramids, that the brightest star in the sky, the one we call Sirius and they called Sopdet, vanished from view for 70 days each year, swallowed by the sun's glare, and then reappeared, rising just before dawn on one particular morning in high summer, and that this morning, the heliacal rising, as astronomers say, fell each year at almost exactly the moment the flood began to lift, star and river keeping the same appointment, heaven and water synchronized, and from that observation they built a calendar of 12 months of 30 days each, plus 5 extra days tacked on at the year's end, birthdays of the gods, days held to be slightly dangerous and unlucky. As anyone who has worked the week between 2 holidays will understand, 365 days in all, the civil year, the first solar calendar on Earth, and the direct ancestor through Julius Caesar, who imported and adapted it with the help of an Alexandrian astronomer, of the very calendar hanging on the wall of the room where you are now falling asleep. The Egyptians even knew their year was a quarter day short. They simply declined, with 3,000 years of magnificent institutional stubbornness, to fix it, letting the civil calendar drift slowly through the seasons, one full lap every 14.5 centuries, a slippage the priests tracked and lived with. And there is something in that choice, the error known, recorded, and written like a slow current rather than corrected, that is so deeply Egyptian, so patient and so strange, that one hardly knows whether to laugh or to bow. The hours, too, are theirs. It was Egyptian astronomers, watching sequences of stars rise through the night like stations passing a train window, who divided the darkness into 12, and the daylight, by the shadow clocks and later the sundials, into 12 to match, giving the world the 24-hour day it has kept ever since. And for the hours after sunset they built water clocks, stone vessels that let the night drip away at a known rate through a small hole, marked inside with graduated rings. And the oldest surviving example carries an inscription noting the difficulty its maker faced, that summer nights are shorter than winter ones, and the vessel's markings adjust for the month, which means the object in the museum case is not just a clock, but a solved problem, and the solver knew it, and signed. So when you hear that the pyramid sides face true north within a 20th of a degree, this is the workshop that behind it stands, the rope stretchers with their cords, the scribes with their fractions, the priests on the temple roof watching Sopdet clear the horizon through the last blue of the night. A civilization that had quietly made itself, before almost anything else, an instrument for paying attention, and the pyramids are what such an instrument builds when someone asks it for a mountain. One more craft belongs in this company, and then we will let the Great Pyramid have its chapter. And it is the craft that moved everything, because every block, every obelisk, every colossus and coffin and jar of oil in this entire story traveled, at some point, by water. Egypt was a boat civilization to a degree matched perhaps nowhere else on Earth. The river its only road, and its boatwrights worked in a land almost without tall timber, building their everyday craft from bundled papyrus reeds and their great vessels from short planks of local acacia joined. An ancient writer says, like courses of brickwork, sewn and pegged into hulls that could carry. The reliefs insist and the engineering confirms. Obelisks of several hundred tons down the current from Aswan. The stone loaded on barges between banks of oarsmen. And at Aswan itself, there lies to this day the most instructive single object in all of Egyptian engineering. The unfinished obelisk, a shaft of granite 137 feet long, which would have been the largest ever raised, abandoned in the quarry when a crack opened along its length, still attached to the bedrock on its underside, with the workmen's pounding stones, balls of harder dolerite with which the granite was bruised away, blow by blow, since no copper tool will cut it, still lying in the trench. A project stopped mid-heartbeat, and standing at its edge you can read the whole method at a glance, and also the whole risk. Months of labor by hundreds of men surrendered in an afternoon to a flaw in the stone, and the decision to walk away, which some foreman had to make and report, written nowhere and legible everywhere. And the boats went with the dead, as everything went with the dead. Model boats by the dozen in the tombs of officials, full crews of little wooden rowers pulling for eternity, and beside the Great Pyramid itself, whose chapter has now fully arrived, archaeologists in 1954 lifted a row of 41 limestone slabs at the base of the south face and found beneath them a sealed pit holding a full-sized royal ship, 143 feet of cedar of Lebanon, disassembled with perfect care into 1,224 pieces and stacked in order, oars, cabin, curling papyriform prow and all, the timbers still smelling. The excavators swore, faintly of cedar after 4,500 years, and it took a restorer named Ahmed Youssef Mustafa, working with a patience the original builders would have saluted, the better part of 2 decades to learn the old sewn boat craft and put her back together, seaworthy in every joint, the oldest intact ship in existence, buried, most Egyptologists believe, so that the king would have his vessel for the voyage we have already sailed, the nightly passage with the sun, and I can think of no better door through which to enter the story of the man in the mountain than this one, a ship of cedar, dismantled, labeled piece by piece, and laid down in the dark in perfect order, against the morning when someone would need it whole again, which is, when you come to think of it, this entire civilization, described in a single object, and as it happens, a description that came true, though the someone, 4.5 millennia downstream, turned out to be us, the mountain of Khufu. And so we arrive, in the natural course of the story, at the place every telling of Egypt must eventually arrive, a limestone plateau on the desert's edge just west of modern Cairo, at the monument that has stood for 4,500 years as the single most famous structure human beings have ever raised. Sneferu's son and successor was named Khufu, and somewhere around 2560 BC, he began, on the plateau of Giza, the pyramid that the ancient world would come to list first among its 7 wonders. And of those 7, it is worth saying plainly, the only one still standing. The numbers have been recited for centuries, and they have never lost their power. So let us recite them slowly, the way they deserve. The Great Pyramid originally rose to a height of around 480 feet, and it remained the tallest building on Earth for nearly 4,000 years, until the cathedral spires of medieval Europe finally, barely, overtook it. It contains something in the neighborhood of 2,300,000 blocks of stone, with an average weight of about 2.5 tons each, some of the granite blocks in its interior weighing far more. And those granite blocks came from quarries at Aswan, 500 miles upriver, floated down the Nile on barges. Its base covers about 13 acres, and that base is level across the whole 13 acres to within less than an inch. Its four sides are aligned to the 4 points of the compass with an accuracy that surveyors today, with modern instruments, regard with open professional respect, off true north by a margin so small that scholars write papers arguing about how the builders could possibly have achieved it, with the leading theories involving careful observation of the circling northern stars. Whoever set out that base was not guessing, and the entire colossal thing, by our best current understanding, was built in roughly 20 years or a little more, meaning that on average, throughout Khufu's reign, a multi-ton block of stone was quarried, moved, raised, and set in place every few minutes of every working day for 2 decades. The question everyone asks next is the right question, and it deserves an honest answer rather than a mysterious one. How? And the first part of the honest answer is that we do not know every detail and should admit it cheerfully. The Egyptians left no engineering manual, no diagram of their methods, and the precise scheme by which the highest courses of stone were raised, whether by one great straight ramp, or a ramp corkscrewing around the outside, or ramps hidden inside the structure itself, or levering, or some combination that shifted as the pyramid rose, remains genuinely unsettled, with rival theories climbing over each other every few years. But the second part of the honest answer matters more, and it is this. Every serious line of evidence agrees that human beings did this, with the tools of their time, copper chisels and wooden sledges and ropes and ramps and levers, and staggering, disciplined, superbly organized labor. And we know a remarkable amount about the people themselves, because in recent decades archaeologists have found and excavated the town they lived in, just south of the plateau. And here the story becomes, quietly, one of the most satisfying corrections in all of archaeology. Because for more than 2,000 years, ever since Herodotus repeated the tales his Egyptian guides told him, the world believed the pyramids were built by slaves, whole enslaved nations groaning under the whip. And the popular imagination believes it still. The town in the desert says otherwise. The builders of Giza lived in barracks and houses, organized into named work gangs with a cheerfulness that survives on the stones themselves, because the gangs painted their names on the blocks they laid, in hidden places never meant to be seen. And the names say things like Friends of Khufu and Drunkards of Menkaure, which are not, whatever else one may say about them, the words of broken men. They were paid in bread and beer, the twin staples of every Egyptian table, and the bakeries and breweries found in their town were of industrial size, producing thousands of loaves a day. They ate meat, and not scraps either. The bone evidence shows prime cattle driven in from the delta. When they were hurt, they were treated, and the skeletons of workers show mended fractures, healed breaks that required weeks of care and splinting, which is to say, a man who broke his arm building Khufu's pyramid was worth healing, and was healed, and went back to work. And when they died, they were buried in their own cemetery on the plateau's edge, in little tombs built in imitation of the great ones, with their titles recorded, overseer of 10, director of the side of the pyramid, and their small hoarded dignity intact, within sight of the eternal monument they had helped to raise. The picture that emerges is not a picture of slavery. It is a picture of national service, of farming families sending their sons, particularly in the flood season when the fields were underwater and farm work stopped anyway, to labor for the God King in return for food, lodging, and something the texts suggest they genuinely felt, a share in the great project of their world, the raising of the mountain that would carry the king, and with him the whole order of Egypt, safely into eternity. It was hard, dangerous, monumental work, and no one should romanticize the toil of it. But the deepest thing the evidence tells us is that the Great Pyramid was built by Egypt, willingly, the way a cathedral town builds its cathedral, and that the whip-driven multitude of legend never existed. Herodotus, bless him, wrote down what he was told. It was 2,000 years after the fact, and his guides were wrong. Of Khufu himself, the man inside the mountain, we know almost embarrassingly little. And the one detail everyone repeats is a genuine irony of history. The builder of the largest monument ever raised for a single human being is represented today, in terms of surviving royal portraits confidently attached to his name, chiefly by one ivory figurine, about 3 inches tall, found not at Giza but far away at Abydos, a tiny seated king with a round, mild face, small enough to close your hand around, 480 feet of stone, and 3 inches of ivory. Later tradition, as I mentioned, remembered Khufu as a harsh king, closing temples and grinding his people. But the later tradition also demonstrably garbled a great deal, and modern historians tend to shrug at the portrait, noting that the same evidence that dismantled the slavery legend sits awkwardly beside any picture of pure tyranny. The honest position is that the man is gone, out of reach, and the mountain remains, which is, when you think about it, exactly the outcome he was hoping for, if not quite in the way he imagined. Khufu's successors completed the plateau. His son Khafra raised the second pyramid of Giza, a few feet shorter than his father's but built on slightly higher ground, so that it cheats gracefully and appears the taller of the two. And it keeps near its summit a cap of the original polished white casing stones, a small surviving patch of the gleam that once covered all 3 pyramids entirely, because we should pause and remember that the pyramids as built did not look as they look now. They were cased, everyone, in fine white limestone polished to reflect the sun, and they would have shone, visible for miles, blinding at noon, and it was only in the Middle Ages that the casing was stripped for building stone, much of it carried off to build the mosques and walls of Cairo, so that the pyramids we see are, in a sense, skinned. The rough inner masonry of monuments whose finished faces now live on, scattered and anonymous, in the fabric of a medieval city. And beside his pyramid, Khafra, or his sculptors, gave the world one more colossus, carving from a knoll of living rock left behind in the quarry, a creature with the body of a resting lion and the face, almost certainly, of the king himself, gazing out at the sunrise, 240 feet long, the largest statue of the ancient world. Later ages called it the Sphinx, a Greek name from a Greek myth that has nothing much to do with it, and later ages also buried it, or rather the desert did, sand filling the quarry hollow around it again and again until only the head rose above the surface, and there is a wonderful inscription on a stone slab between its paws, set up 1,000 years after the Sphinx was carved, in which a young prince of a much later dynasty records that he fell asleep in its shadow while hunting, and dreamed the Sphinx spoke to him, complaining of the sand upon it and promising him the throne if he would clear it away. He cleared it, and he got the throne. And whatever one makes of the dream, the little story is worth keeping, because it means the Sphinx was already ancient, already half-buried, already a mystery being rescued by archaeology, 1,000 years before our own era's archaeologists were dreamed of. Egypt was so old that it contained its own antiquity. The third pyramid, much smaller, was raised by Menkaure, remembered in later tales as a kind and just king, and with him the greatest age of pyramid building passed its peak, not because Egypt forgot how, but because, one suspects, the point had been made, and the enormous cost of making it again and again had begun to tell. The long afternoon, and the first fall. The Old Kingdom, the age of the pyramid builders, lasted in all for the better part of 500 years, and its ending is one of the most instructive passages in the whole of Egyptian history, though it is a quieter story than the raising of the monuments, the way endings usually are. The last great king of the age was Pepi II, who came to the throne as a small child and reigned, according to tradition, for somewhere in the neighborhood of 90 years, possibly the longest reign in recorded history, and, the historian's consensus runs, considerably too long. Around the throne of the boy, and then the man, and then the very old man, power slowly leaked outward and downward, into the hands of the provincial governors, the local grandees of the 42 districts of Egypt, offices that had once rotated at the king's pleasure and had gradually, fatally become hereditary. Fathers passed provinces to sons. Local lords built themselves fine tombs in their own local cemeteries, no longer clustering for eternity around the king's pyramid, which is a small detail with a loud meaning, because where an Egyptian chose to be buried tells you exactly where he believed eternity was administered from. And when Pepi II at last died, having outlived his heirs and exhausted the momentum of his line, the center simply failed to hold. But there was, most Egyptologists now believe, another actor in the collapse, older and larger than any court, and it was the river itself. Climate records pieced together from lake beds and river sediments point to a stretch of decades, right around this time, when the monsoon rains far to the south weakened and the Nile floods came in low, year upon year, and a low flood in Egypt meant fields the water never reached, meant a harvest that fell short, meant, if it happened again and again, hunger on a national scale. The whole edifice of the Old Kingdom, the God-King guaranteeing the order of the world, the granaries, the pyramids themselves, rested on the river's annual promise, and when the promise failed, the theology failed with it, because what exactly was a God-King for if the flood would not come at his word? The country broke apart. For roughly a century and a half, the period historians call the First Intermediate Period, Egypt was again two lands, and sometimes more than two. Rival dynasties in the north and south, provincial warlords feeding their own people first, skirmishes and raids, and, in the texts written afterward, famine remembered with real horror, including passages that claim people ate the unthinkable, though scholars debate, as scholars should, how much of that is sober report and how much the rhetoric of chaos, written by men whose whole purpose was to make disorder sound as terrible as possible. And yet, and this is why I said the passage is instructive, the First Intermediate Period was not only a catastrophe, and modern historians have grown steadily more interested in what it built. With the royal center broken, things loosened. Local lords, needing followers, had to earn them, and their tomb inscriptions begin to boast not of their birth, but of their performance. I fed my town in the years of hunger. I gave grain to the one who had none. I did not prefer the great to the humble, which is the sound, however self-serving, of accountability entering the language of power. Art in the provinces went strange and lively, freed from the polished court style. And somewhere in these rough decades happened the single most consequential religious shift in Egyptian history, one we will feel underneath everything for the rest of this story. In the Old Kingdom, the glorious afterlife, the ascent to the stars, the spells and provisions, had belonged, in the fullest sense, to the king, with everyone else hoping at best to serve within his eternity. In the fractured years, that monopoly broke. The sacred texts, once reserved for the burial chambers of pharaohs, began appearing, adapted, on the coffins of ordinary well-off people, provincial officials, their wives, town worthies, and Egyptologists call these the coffin texts, and what they represent, in plain language, is the democratization of the afterlife, eternity thrown open to anyone who could afford a decorated coffin, and, in principle, by the logic now unfolding, to anyone at all. From this point forward, every Egyptian, not just the king, would face the same judgment after death, and could hope for the same paradise. And we will stand before that judgment scene ourselves a little later in the night, in what may be the most humane single image the ancient world produced. It is a pattern we have met before in these stories, and will meet again, the collapse that nobody chose and nobody wanted, quietly handing down a legacy that the golden age it destroyed could never have produced on its own. Order returned in the end, as order in Egypt always seemed to, when a family of princes from a southern town called Thebes, a place that had been nothing much at all in the days of the pyramid builders, fought their way to mastery of the whole country and stitched the two lands back together. Egypt's first great age had ended in drought, division, and doubt. Its second was about to begin, and it would be, in the judgment of the Egyptians themselves looking back, the classical age, the time when the language was at its purest and the kings were at their wisest, the age every later Egypt would try to imitate. But the innocence, if that is the word, never came back. The Egyptians of the Old Kingdom had believed the world was permanent because they had never seen it break. The Egyptians of every age afterward knew better, and their greatest literature, which we are about to meet, is soaked through with exactly that knowledge. The beautiful, melancholy, entirely modern understanding that everything, even Egypt, is mortal. The classical kingdom. The reunifier was named Mentuhotep II, and the age he opened, which historians call the Middle Kingdom, has always suffered slightly in the popular imagination for the unglamorous reason that it built no Giza and left no golden mask, and it deserves far better, because by the Egyptians' own reckoning it was the high noon of their civilization. This was the age when the machinery of the state was rebuilt deliberately, with the lessons of the collapse fresh in mind. The kings of the 12th dynasty, the great royal house of the period, ruled not as remote gods on the Old Kingdom model, but as something new in the world's political vocabulary, the shepherd king, the working monarch, and their official literature says so in almost exactly those words, presenting the king as the herdsman of his people, appointed by the gods not merely to be adored, but to labor, to stay awake at night over the country's troubles while his flock sleeps. One royal text of the period has the old king advising his son with a weariness that still startles readers, telling him plainly to trust no brother and know no friend, because the king had, in this very text's telling, been attacked in his own palace by the very people he had fed, and whatever the historical truth behind the lines, the tone tells you everything about the distance Egypt had traveled from the serene confidence of the Pyramid Age. These were kings who knew the world could break, because it had. They were also, in the plainest practical sense, builders and administrators of the First Order. The greatest of them, Senusret III, a king remembered for centuries afterward as the very model of Pharaoh, broke the power of the old provincial families once and for all, folding their hereditary little kingdoms back into a professional national administration, and the royal portraits of his reign are among the most arresting objects Egypt ever produced, because they abandon, deliberately, the eternal youthful serenity of every earlier royal face and show instead a middle-aged man, heavy-lidded, lined, grim around the mouth, careworn in a way no god needs to be. Scholars still argue about what the new style meant, whether it was propaganda of the burdened shepherd or something closer to actual portraiture. But no one who looks at those brooding faces forgets them. To the south, in Nubia, the gold country beyond the first cataract, these kings pushed the border upriver and anchored it with a chain of mud brick fortresses whose scale still astonishes the specialists who study them. Walls 30 feet thick, bastions and dry moats, and covered stairways down to the river, garrisons and granaries and dispatch systems, and the surviving dispatches themselves, reports sent downriver recording the movement of every trader and herdsman past the frontier, are so dry, so procedural, so exactly like the paperwork of every border post in every age, that reading them collapses 4,000 years into nothing. And in the marshy basin of the Fayum, west of the river, the Middle Kingdom carried out what may have been the largest land reclamation project of the ancient world, managing the lake, draining and diking, adding thousands of acres of farmland, the kind of enormous, patient, entirely unromantic public works that never makes it into legend, and that feeds the people who make the legends possible. But the truest glory of the Middle Kingdom was made of words. This was Egypt's literary golden age, the period whose compositions became the classics that schoolboys would copy for the next 1,500 years. And it is here, for the first time in human history, that we meet literature in the full sense. Stories written not to record a king's deeds or please a god, but to explore what it feels like to be a person. The masterpiece, by common consent, ancient and modern, is the tale of Sinu, and it is worth a moment of your drowsy attention, because it is the world's oldest great story of exile and homecoming. Sinu is a palace official who, overhearing by accident a whisper of conspiracy at the death of the old king, panics, for reasons even he cannot fully explain, and flees Egypt across the border, out into the lands of the Asiatic herdsmen, where he lives for decades, prospers, marries a chieftain's daughter, raises sons, wins wealth and honor, and a famous single combat, and is, by every visible measure, a success, and is all the while quietly, incurably homesick. The poem's ending, which moved Egyptian readers for 1,000 years and moves readers still, comes when the king of Egypt, hearing that the old exile still lives, writes inviting him home, and Sinu, now an aged man, returns. Trembling, is forgiven his flight, is washed and shaved and dressed again in linen. The years of the desert, as the poem says, handed back to the sand, and is granted the one thing he has ached for through the whole story, which is not treasure and not office, but a tomb, a proper Egyptian burial in the Black Land, so that his eternity will be spent at home. That is the deepest window the Middle Kingdom gives us into the Egyptian soul. Heaven itself had a geography, and it was local. To die abroad was the real death. And alongside Sinuhe, the age produced a whole shelf of startling things. The eloquent peasant, in which a poor man robbed on the road pleads his case before a magistrate with such astonishing eloquence that the court secretly prolongs the case, refusing to rule so that he must keep pleading while they write his speeches down. A premise that manages to be a comedy, a protest against injustice, and a meditation on why the powerful listen to the powerless all at once. And darker works too. A dialogue between a world-weary man and his own soul debating whether life is worth continuing. Harpists' songs that shrug gently, that no one has ever come back from the dead to tell us how they fare, so spend a pleasant day while you can. Read those lines cold and you would guess Ecclesiastes or a modern poet. They were written 4,000 years ago, in the confident heart of the classical kingdom, and they are the proof, if proof were needed, that the people of this story were never exotic props in golden costumes. They were us, with the same night thoughts, an unimaginably long time ago. Bread, beer, and the ordinary day. Let us step away from the kings for a while, because a civilization is not its kings, and one of the quiet miracles of Egyptology is how much we actually know about the daily life of ordinary Egyptians. Thanks to the dry sand that preserved what damper lands devour, letters, laundry lists, sandals, toys, half-eaten loaves. The Egypt of any period was overwhelmingly a country of farming villages, flat-roofed houses of sun-dried mud brick clustered on the high ground above the flood line, and the rhythm of every life in them was the river's rhythm. Planting on the fresh silt, harvest under the winter sun, and the long flooded weeks of the inundation when the fields were a sheet of water and the state, as we have seen, might call a family's young men away to haul stone. The diet, from the king's table to the field hands, rested on two things, bread and beer, and the beer deserves its footnote, because Egyptian beer was not a vice, but a food, thick, soup-like, mildly alcoholic, drunk daily by everyone including children, safer than untreated water and nourishing enough that wages across the whole of Egyptian history were routinely reckoned and paid in it. Bread and beer were the paycheck of the pyramid builder and the offering set before the gods, and the phrase bread and beer became, in the language itself, a way of saying all good things, so that a polite Egyptian greeting to the dead was to wish them 1,000 of bread and 1,000 of beer forever. Within the mud brick houses, family life was warm, and the evidence for its warmth is everywhere. In painted scenes of husbands and wives seated with arms around each other, their children and cats underfoot. In love poetry from the later periods in which young men and women call each other brother and sister, which unsettles the modern reader until one learns it was simply the language of closeness and sigh at doors that will not open. And in the letters, above all, actual private letters, dictated to scribes, full of scolding and worry and gossip. A soldier writing home to demand why no one has sent word about the baby, a mother reminded. A household managed from afar. Egyptian women, it must be said, held a legal position that would not be matched again in the Western world until virtually the modern era. A woman in Egypt could own property in her own name, buy and sell it, inherit, lend at interest, initiate a lawsuit, and initiate a divorce. and marriage itself was a private, civil arrangement, frequently accompanied by a written contract spelling out, with unsentimental clarity, exactly what property the wife brought and what she would take away if the marriage ended. None of this made Egypt a paradise of equality. Public office and the scribal schools remained, with rare exceptions, a male world. But the everyday legal personhood of Egyptian women astonished ancient visitors and Greek writers, coming from a world where a respectable woman could own almost nothing, recorded it with a mixture of fascination and alarm. Children played with dolls with real hair and balls of stitched leather and carved wooden animals with moving jaws, several of which survive. And adults played too, above all a board game called Senet, a race game of 30 squares whose boards turn up everywhere from workmen's huts to the tomb of Tutankhamun, and which began as a pastime and slowly turned, in the way of Egyptian things, into a symbol, the game of passage through the underworld, so that painted tomb scenes show the dead playing Senet against an invisible opponent for the highest imaginable stakes. There were doctors, and here again Egypt startles, because surviving medical papyri show a profession already specialized. One text famous for treating injuries in a rigorously practical sequence: wounds of the head, then neck, then downward through the body. Each case sorted with the same 3 verdicts: an ailment I will treat, an ailment I will contend with, an ailment not to be treated, which is medical honesty of a kind some ages since have lacked, mixed, it is true, with spells and with remedies involving substances no modern patient would consent to, but grounded, at its best, in close observation, splints, sutures, honey on wounds, which does in fact resist infection. And everywhere, woven through every layer of the ordinary day, there were the animals. And no people on earth has ever lived with animals quite the way the Egyptians did. Geese in the yard, monkeys as pets, dogs with recorded names, brave one, reliable, and reigning over the household. Needless to say, the cat, welcomed originally because it killed the snakes and the granary mice, kept ever after because it was a cat, mourned when it died, in the later periods, by families who shaved their eyebrows in grief, and associated with a goddess of home and protection, so that the animal drowsing at the foot of many a listener's bed at this very moment descends, in an unbroken line, from the pampered mousers of the Nile, the weighing of the heart. And so we come, as every Egyptian life came, to the question of the end. And I want to take this slowly, both because it is the heart of everything and because no part of Egypt has been more thoroughly misunderstood. The popular picture of the Egyptians as a people morbidly in love with death has it, most Egyptologists would tell you, precisely backward. The Egyptians loved life, loved it with an intensity that shines out of every painted wall. The fowling trips in the marshes, the banquets, the music, the beloved gardens with their pools. And it was exactly because they loved it so much that they refused, with 3,000 years of sustained ingenuity, to accept that it ends. The tomb was not a house of death. It was a machine for continuing, and everything placed in it, the food, the furniture, the servant figures, the paintings of feasts, existed to carry the ordinary sweetness of Egyptian life across the border of the grave. To manage the crossing, the body itself had to endure, for the Egyptians held that a person was a bundle of parts, body and name and shadow, and the Ka, the life force that needed food and drink, and the Bial, the traveling soul, pictured as a bird with a human face that could fly out into the sunlight by day but must return to the body at night. And if the body was lost, the whole delicate system failed. Hence mummification and the process, refined over centuries into a craft of genuine sophistication, took 70 days. The internal organs removed and preserved in their own 4 jars under the protection of 4 minor gods. The heart alone left carefully in place, for reasons we will come to in a moment. The brain, which the Egyptians considered unimportant, an opinion they share with the authors of certain comment sections, removed and discarded. The body dried out completely in natron salt for 40 days, then washed, oiled, wrapped in hundreds of yards of linen with amulets folded between the layers, and masked. so that the finished mummy was less a preserved corpse than a devotional object, a statue with a person inside. It was expensive, and the full rite belonged to the rich, but the logic of the fractured years had done its quiet work, and versions existed at every price, down to the simple natron and plain wrappings of the poor, because eternity, since the great democratization, was everyone's right. But the body was only the vehicle. The real crossing was moral, and this is the part of Egyptian religion that deserves to be far more famous than it is. The dead, every dead person, king and fisherman alike, traveled to the Hall of Judgment before Osiris, the god who had himself died and been restored and now ruled the world below, and there, watched by 42 divine assessors, the heart of the dead, the seat of mind and conscience, was placed on a great balance and weighed against a single feather, the feather of Mayat, of truth, that same word we carried with us from the beginning of the night, and the dead person spoke, reciting the long declaration that scholars call the negative confession. I have not committed evil against men. I have not mistreated cattle. I have not made anyone weep. I have not taken milk from the mouths of children. I have not held back the water in its season. I have not put out a fire in its time. I am pure, I am pure, I am pure. If the heart, freighted with hidden wrongs, sank heavier than the feather, a waiting creature, part crocodile, part lion, part hippopotamus, with the frank name devourer of hearts, ate it, and the person ceased forever, which was the true Egyptian hell. Not torment, but erasure. But if the scales balanced, the dead one was declared true of voice and passed onward into the field of reeds. And the field of reeds, this is the detail I find most moving in all of Egyptian religion, was not a paradise of clouds or banquets of the gods. It was Egypt, a perfected Egypt, the fields heavy with impossible harvests, the river always in gentle flood, the family restored around you, the cat on your lap, the beer good forever. Offered eternity, anything imaginable. The Egyptians asked for their own lives back, the same mud brick house and the same beloved faces, minus only sickness, hunger, and parting. 4,000 years of theology, and at the bottom of it, the plainest human wish there is, that a good, ordinary day should never have to end. The famous scrolls of spells that guided the dead through all this, the collection we call the Book of the Dead, sold by temple scribes with the buyer's name filled into blank spaces, were in the end simply travel documents for that journey home, and if the whole apparatus had a flaw, the Egyptians themselves saw it, for one of the spells exists to prevent the heart from testifying against its owner, which means, if you think it through in the dark for a moment, that the civilization that invented the judgment of the dead also immediately invented the fear of failing it and tried, with touching futility, to write itself a note from home. They were, in every era of this story, exactly like us, the nightly voyage and the family quarrel that ran the universe. Since we have stood at the scales of judgment, this is the natural place in the night to meet, properly, the gods themselves, because no story of Egypt makes sense without them, and no aspect of Egypt is more cheerfully misrepresented. The Egyptian pantheon looks, from outside, like a zoo of the imagination, gods with the heads of falcons and jackals and crocodiles and hippopotamuses, and the animal heads have led every generation of outsiders, starting with the Greeks and Romans who giggled at them openly, to conclude that the Egyptians worshipped beasts. They did not, or not exactly. The animal forms were closer to what a modern mind might call icons, or even diagrams, a way of writing a god's nature visibly on the god's body, the falcon for the god of the sky and kingship because nothing surveys the world from higher, the jackal for the god of embalming because jackals patrolled the desert cemeteries and had, so to speak, professional expertise. And the same god could be shown as animal, as human with animal head, or as pure symbol, depending on which truth about the god the artist needed to tell that day. And the Egyptians moved among these forms without the least confusion, in the way that you can hold in your mind at once a photograph of a loved one, a memory of their voice, and their name written down, and know that none of these is the person, and all of them are true. At the center of the whole system, rehearsed every single day of those 3,000 years, was a story, and it is the best story the Egyptians ever told. And it was about the sun, and it was, when you hold it up to the light, about sleep. Each evening the Egyptians held, the sun god Ra grew old and weary over the course of the day, rising as a child in the morning, blazing in strength at noon, and sinking, stooped and dim, into the western horizon, the direction of every tomb. And there he boarded a boat. Because of course he did. Everything important in Egypt traveled by boat and sailed down into the underworld, into the 12 hours of the night. And the night was not empty. Hour by hour, the solar boat traveled a dark river through territories of peril, gates that had to be opened with the correct words, banks lined with the blessed dead who woke and rejoiced for the 1 hour the light passed among them, and, coiled in the deepest hours, the serpent Apophis, chaos itself in a body, vast enough to drink the river dry, who every single night attacked the boat to stop the sun forever, and every single night was fought off by the gods aboard, including, standing at the prow with his spear of all possible champions, Set, the violent, disreputable god of storms and disorder, because the Egyptians understood, with a subtlety their reputation rarely receives, that you fight chaos with a professional. And in the deepest hour of all, the sun god came to the cavern where Osiris, king of the dead, waited, and the two gods, the soul of yesterday and the soul of tomorrow, met and merged for a moment. And out of that meeting the sun was renewed, made young, and rose in the east reborn as the morning, and the whole world with it. Every sunrise, in other words, was a victory that had been genuinely in doubt. Every night was a battle fought on your behalf while you slept, and the priests in the temples kept vigil through the dark hours partly for this reason, chanting the hostile serpent back, hour by hour, until dawn. I know of no ancient image kinder to a sleepless listener than this one, and I offer it to you at face value, that in the oldest sustained cosmology our species produced, the night is not an absence. It is a passage, with a ferryman and lamps and company, and it has never once, in all the history of the world, failed to end in morning. The other great story, the one that governed death as the voyage of Ra governed night, was a family quarrel, and the Egyptians told it so well that it outlived them, spreading through the Roman Empire as a mystery religion that competed, for a couple of centuries, with Christianity itself. Osiris, the story ran, had been the first king of Egypt, a good king who taught humanity farming and law, and his brother Set envied him and built, at a banquet, a marvelous chest made exactly to Osiris's measurements, promising it to whichever guest fit it perfectly. And when Osiris, obligingly, lay down in it, Set slammed the lid, sealed it with molten lead, and threw it in the Nile, and later, for thoroughness, cut the body into pieces and scattered them the length of Egypt. And Osiris's wife, his sister and Queen Isis, did not accept it. That is the entire engine of the story, and the reason it mattered to every widow and orphan in the valley. Isis searched the whole river world for the pieces of her husband, gathered them one by one, every district of Egypt later claiming proudly to be the burial place of one fragment or another, which was excellent for local tourism. Reassembled them with the help of Anubis, the jackal-headed embalmer, inventing in the process the first mummy, and by the strength of her magic. And Isis was explicitly the greatest magician in the universe, human or divine. She restored Osiris to life long enough to conceive a son, and Osiris then descended to rule the dead, not as exile, but as enthronement, becoming the judge before whom, as we have seen, every soul would stand, while Isis raised the boy, Horus the falcon, in hiding in the delta marshes, protecting him from Set through a childhood of scorpion stings and fevers that made her, ever after, the goddess to whom Egyptian mothers prayed over sick children. And when Horus came of age, he challenged his uncle for the throne of the world, and the gods convened as a tribunal, and the case of Horus against Set dragged on. The texts say with a straight face, for 80 years, with proceedings, adjournments, briefs, and one uproarious surviving account in which the tribunal behaves so much like every committee that has ever existed, dodging, deferring, writing to absent senior gods for advisory opinions, that scholars genuinely debate whether the text is scripture or satire, the safest answer being, in the Egyptian manner, both. Horus prevailed in the end. Set was not destroyed. Chaos never is. He was reassigned, sent to the prow of the sun boat to spear the serpent. Disorder harnessed to defend order, which may be the single wisest move in any mythology. And every living pharaoh thereafter was Horus enthroned, and every dead pharaoh was Osiris vindicated, and every grieving family in Egypt buried its dead inside the shape of the story. The searching, the reassembly, the restoration, the trial survived, the throne beyond. When you see a mummy in a museum case, you are looking at a body dressed as Osiris, prepared by a religion whose central figure was not a warrior or a lawgiver, but a wife who refused to stop looking. Below the great gods, and much closer to the floor, lived the household gods, and I have a particular fondness for these, because they show us what Egyptian religion looked like on an ordinary Tuesday, away from the granite and the incense. The great state temples, we should be clear, were not congregational. An ordinary Egyptian never entered the inner halls of Karnak in their life. The sanctuaries were staffed sanctums where priests, on the community's behalf, woke the god's statue each morning, washed it, dressed it, perfumed it, and served it breakfast. The offerings afterward, by the tidy doctrine called reversion, coming back out to feed the temple staff, piety and payroll in a single system. Household religion was different. It lived in wall niches in ordinary homes, and its great figures were two of the least dignified and most beloved gods Egypt ever made. Bes, a stumpy, bandy-legged, lion-maned dwarf, shone always full face, sticking out his tongue, sometimes waving knives, sometimes a tambourine, patron of childbirth, children, dancers, and the home, whose entire divine job was to caper and grimace and be so cheerfully hideous that demons, sickness, and nightmares fled the house. And Taweret, the pregnant hippopotamus goddess, upright on lion feet with a crocodile's tail down her back, protector of women in labor, and if it seems strange that expectant mothers took comfort in a hippopotamus, remember that the female hippopotamus was the most ferociously protective mother the Egyptians ever had the chance to observe at close range, and they had excellent reasons to have observed her closely. These two are everywhere in the archaeology, on beds, on headrests, on the little ivory wands that were laid, teeth outward, in a protective arc around sleeping children, and they were painted on the walls of the workmen's bedrooms at Deir el-Medina, and they mattered, day to day, hour by hour, more than a moon in all his gold ever did, because a moon ran the cosmos, but Bez stood guard at the crib. And it was to this domestic layer of heaven that ordinary prayer belonged, and some of it survives, on humble stones from that same village, and it will bend your heart. A draftsman named Nebro, raising a monument of thanksgiving because his son lay sick, and, as the inscription says, he found the god coming as sweet breeze. A workman confessing that he had sworn falsely by the god and been struck blind, as he believed, in punishment, and begging, in carved words he paid real wages for, to see darkness turn to light again. The tone not of ritual, but of relationship, reproach and gratitude and bargaining. The full domestic weather of faith. Herodotus called the Egyptians the most religious of all peoples, and the line is quoted everywhere. But the stones from the village say something better than most religious. They say the gods of Egypt lived in the house, like relatives, and were spoken to accordingly. And several times a year, the two layers met, and those meetings were the festivals. And the festivals are the last thing to know about Egyptian religion, because they were the moments the whole system turned inside out. At the great festival of Opet at Thebes, the statue of Amun left his sanctuary and traveled, in a gilded boat carried on the shoulders of priests, out among the crowds, from Karnak to Luxor Temple and back, through streets lined with the entire city. And it was then, with the god abroad in the open air, that ordinary people could put their questions to him directly, yes or no questions presented to the moving boat, which answered, "The records insist," by dipping forward for yes or retreating for no. The shoulders of the porters presumably interpreting the divine will as shoulders always have, and lawsuits, job appointments, and accusations of theft were genuinely settled this way. Oracle as public utility. At the festival of the goddess Hathor, lady of love, music, and drunkenness, the faithful were, quite officially, expected to drink themselves into oblivion, sacred intoxication as communion, and the temple accounts budget for it. At the feast called the Beautiful Festival of the Valley, the whole population of Thebes crossed the river to the cemeteries on the west bank and held family picnics in the tomb chapels of their ancestors, eating and drinking and singing with the dead, the harpists performing those gently skeptical songs we heard earlier. Spend a pleasant day, and this picnic among the graves with the wine going round is perhaps the clearest window of all, because it shows what the whole apparatus, the mummies and the scales and the spells and the hippopotamus at the crib, was actually for. It was for keeping company across the border. The dead were not gone, they were across the river, and once a year you went and had lunch with them and told them the news. And it would be a poor historian who could not see, in the lamp-lit chapels of that festival, the same instinct that brings flowers to a headstone on a Sunday afternoon in any country on earth tonight. The costumes of faith change utterly. The errand does not. The humiliation and the lesson. The Middle Kingdom did not fall the way the Old Kingdom had fallen, in drought and fragmentation from within. It ended, over a long, slow slide that historians still argue about, with something Egypt had never experienced in its entire history, something the protective deserts had promised could never happen: foreign rule. Through the later years of the Middle Kingdom, people from the lands northeast of Egypt, from Canaan and beyond, had been drifting into the eastern delta, some as traders, some as hired sailors and soldiers, some as captives, many simply as families looking for better land, the kind of slow, ordinary migration that every prosperous country in every age attracts. They settled, generation after generation, keeping their own names and gods alongside new Egyptian habits, until the eastern delta was, in effect, a bilingual borderland. And when the central government weakened, as governments in this story reliably do, the strongest power in that borderland was no longer Egyptian. A line of foreign kings took the north. The Egyptians called them, with a shudder that echoes through every later text, the rulers of foreign lands, a phrase that comes down to us through Greek as Hyksos, and for roughly a century they governed Lower Egypt from a delta city called Avaris, while native Egyptian dynasties held on at Thebes in the south, paying, at least at times, a humiliating deference to the northerners. And a third power, the Nubian kingdom of Kush, pressed Egypt's southern flank in what amounted to a hostile alliance with the Hyksos, so that the ancient kingdom of the pyramid builders found itself squeezed for the first time ever between enemies at both ends of its river. Later, Egyptian propaganda painted the Hyksos arrival as a burning, temple-smashing invasion, and modern archaeology has quietly dismantled most of that picture, finding at Avaris not a razed conquest, but a thriving, mixed, Egyptianizing court. Foreign kings writing their names in hieroglyphs and adopting pharaonic titles, and the honest summary is probably that the Hyksos takeover was less an invasion than an inheritance, a migrant community's leading family stepping into a power vacuum, and that the burning hatred in the Egyptian sources was written afterward, by the winners, who needed the story to be simpler and uglier than it had been. We have met that pattern before in these long nights, and we will meet it again. But the humiliation, however exaggerated in the telling, was real, and so, crucially, was the lesson. because the Hyksos brought with them the military technology of the wider world. Above all, the horse-drawn war chariot and the composite bow, laminated of wood and horn and sinew, with far greater range and power than anything Egyptian, and bronze working of a new standard, and the Egyptians of the south, through their century of resentment, did the most consequential thing a defeated culture can do. They copied their conquerors. Thebes armed itself with the enemy's own weapons, and around 1550 BC, after a war of liberation spanning 3 generations of Theban kings, one of whom, a ruler named Sekenenre, was killed in or near battle, his mummy surviving with the terrible axe wound still readable in the bone, an axe, as it happens, of Hyksos design. The king Ahmose took Avaris, drove the foreign dynasty out through Canaan, crushed the Kushite threat in the south, and reunited the 2 lands. And with that victory, Egypt crossed a threshold it could never cross back. The old faith in the sheltering deserts was dead. The new doctrine, learned in the hardest school, was that safety lay not in walls of sand, but in reach, in garrisons and vassals and buffer lands far beyond the border. And so Egypt, the ancient, inward, self-sufficient kingdom of the river, came out of its valley looking for empire. Historians call what follows the new kingdom. It is the age of the famous names, the age of gold, and it begins, like so many imperial ages, in the memory of a wound, the empire and the hidden valley. The new kingdom Egypt that now unfolds across the next several centuries was a different creature from anything in the story so far. A superpower in a connected world. Its professional army marching as far north as the Euphrates River. Its vassal princes writing anxious letters to the palace. Its treasury swollen above all by Nubian gold. For Egypt now ruled Nubia outright, and it was gold that made Pharaoh's word carry across the whole Near East. Gold, as one foreign king wrote in a begging letter that survives, being as common as dust in the land of Egypt. The center of this world was Thebes, the once minor southern town now grown into one of the great cities of the earth, and its heart was the temple complex of Karnak, home of Amun, the once local Theban god now fused with the sun as Amun-Ra, king of the gods, and Karnak deserves a moment of sleepy wonder in its own right, because it was not a building but an accumulation, a vast walled precinct that pharaoh after pharaoh for 1,500 years enlarged, each adding courts and pylons and obelisks and avenues of sphinxes, until it became what it remains, the largest religious complex ever constructed, its great hypostyle hall alone a forest of 134 columns, the central one 70 feet high and thick enough that 100 people could stand together on the flat top of a single capital. And to the west, across the river from Thebes, where the sun set behind the cliffs, the kings of the new kingdom made a decision that quietly admitted another learned lesson. They stopped building pyramids. A pyramid, they had finally accepted, was not a fortress for eternity, but an advertisement to robbers. Every one of the great monuments of the old ages having been tunneled and emptied, most of them already in antiquity. And so the new kingdom kings hid instead, cutting their tombs deep into the rock of a remote, sun-hammered desert canyon now famous as the Valley of the Kings, the entrances sealed and buried, the work done by a closed community of craftsmen, the whole system wagering eternity on secrecy rather than mass. 60 and more royal tombs would eventually honeycomb that valley, and the wager, it has to be said, failed almost completely. Almost every tomb found and stripped within a few centuries, but the word almost is carrying. In that sentence, one small golden exception that the whole world has heard of, and we will come to him in his proper place, near the end of the dynasty we have just entered, the woman who was king. The 18th dynasty, the royal house of the liberation, produced within a few generations one of the most extraordinary figures in the entire 3,000 years, and her story begins with an inconvenient death. A pharaoh died young, leaving as heir a small boy born of a lesser wife, and the boy king needed a regent, and the natural regent, by rank and blood, was the dead king's principal widow, his half-sister Hatshepsut, daughter of one pharaoh, wife of another, a woman then probably in her 20s, of whom every surviving trace suggests intelligence of a very high order. For a few years she governed as regents had always governed, behind the throne, in the boy's name. And then, somewhere around the 7th year, she did the thing that had no precedent, or almost none. She had herself crowned. Not as queen. Egypt had a word for king's wife, and it was not what she took, but as king pharaoh, with the full 5-fold titulary, the throne name, the double crown. And from then on, for some 15 years, Egypt had 2 kings, the young Thutmose III, kept in his titles, trained, interestingly, in the army, and never, so far as the record shows, disposed of, harmed, or hidden, and Hatshepsut, senior king, in whose hands the actual power plainly rested. The royal art of the reign had to solve a problem no artist had faced, how to show a female king, and its solution still fascinates scholars. Early statues showing a woman in king's regalia, later ones showing the full traditional pharaoh, male-bodied, kilted, wearing the ceremonial false beard that every pharaoh, being a living god, strapped on for ritual, until the inscriptions are dancing through grammatical hoops. His Majesty, she. It is worth being clear, since the point is often mangled, that nobody was fooled, and nobody was meant to be fooled. The beard was not a disguise. It was a uniform. Everyone in Egypt knew perfectly well who the king was. The art was not hiding her, it was arguing, in the only visual language available, that the office she held was fully hers. How she justified the seizure we can partly read on her own temple walls, where she had carved a story of divine birth, the god Amun himself her true father, and a claim that her earthly father had named her heir, which is, most historians suspect, exactly the kind of thing one says afterward. What she did with the power is easier to judge. The reign was, by every measure that survives, a golden one, almost entirely peaceful, stupendously prosperous, thick with building projects from the Delta to Nubia, crowned by 2 achievements in particular. The first was the trading expedition she sent south to the half-legendary land of Punt, somewhere down the Red Sea coast toward the Horn of Africa. 5 ships returning loaded with gold and ebony and ivory and, above all, living myrrh trees, roots balled in baskets. The world's first recorded botanical expedition, all of it carved in loving documentary detail on her temple walls, down to the enormous, sagging portrait of the Queen of Punt, that Egyptian tourists apparently found as memorable as we do. The second was that temple itself, her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri. And I will simply say that if you have ever seen a photograph of one perfect building in Egypt that is not a pyramid, a long horizontal composition of white colonnades rising in 3 terraces against a sheer wall of golden cliff, that is hers, designed quite possibly by the royal steward Senenmut, a commoner risen to unheard-of heights at her side, and about whom ancient workmen scrawled the same speculation on their rest hut walls that modern documentaries put in their titles. None of it provable then or now. And then she died, in the 22nd year of the reign, apparently of natural causes, an aging woman with, her mummy suggests, bad teeth and worse health. And Thutmose III, now a grown man, at last ruled alone, and late in his long reign, this is the coda that darkens the whole tale, someone began systematically erasing her. Her images chiseled from the walls, her name cut out of the royal lists, her statues smashed and dumped in a pit before her own temple, not chaotically but carefully. The erasure aimed at Hatshepsut the king, while often sparing Hatshepsut the queen, as if the crime being prosecuted was not the woman, but the reign. For a century, Egyptology told this as a story of revenge, the suppressed stepson's hatred finally unleashed, and the timeline quietly ruined that story, because the erasure seems to have begun only decades after her death, near the end of Thutmose's own life, which suggests something colder and sadder than rage, a dynastic tidying, an old king, or his heir, deciding that the anomaly of a female pharaoh was a precedent, The royal line could not afford to leave standing, and so unwriting it, the way one corrects a ledger. They very nearly succeeded. Her name fell out of the king lists, out of Manetho's dynasties as they survive, out of memory entirely, and for more than 3,000 years the woman who had ruled the greatest power on earth simply did not exist, until the decipherers and excavators of the modern age, reading the walls she had built, noticing the odd grammar, reassembling the smashed statues from the pit, put her back piece by piece into history. It is the fate she herself had feared and named. On one of her obelisks at Karnak, she had carved a line that reads, now that we can read it again, with an ache she could not have intended. My heart turns this way and that, as I think what the people will say, those who see my monuments in years to come, and speak of what I have done. The general on the throne. As for Thutmose III, whatever his part in the erasure, history has its own verdict on the rest of him, and it is close to awe. The boy who had waited through the long reign, training with the army, took the field within months of Hatshepsut's death, because the vassal princes of Canaan and Syria, sensing transition, had risen in coalition against Egypt, and the campaign that followed opens with the first battle in all of human history that we can reconstruct in detail, because Thutmose brought his own scribe to war and had the daybook carved at Karnak. The rebel coalition massed at Megiddo, a fortress city commanding the trade roads through Canaan, a place so eternally strategic that its very name, via Hebrew, gave the world the word Armageddon. And there were 3 routes by which the Egyptian army could approach, 2 safe and wide, one a narrow pass through the hills. So tight, his own officers protested, that the army would have to march it nearly single file, horse behind horse and man behind man, the vanguard reaching battle while the rear was still hours back in the defile. The council urged the safe roads. The enemy, for precisely the same reasons, watched the safe roads. Thutmose took the pass, and the record preserves his answer to the council, which is the oldest surviving statement of a commander's logic in the world, that the enemy would judge his route by their own caution, and that he would do the thing they had ruled out precisely because they had ruled it out. He emerged behind the coalition's dispositions, formed up unopposed, and broke them in a single morning, and the account then adds a detail no flattering court scribe would have invented, that the routed enemy fled to Megiddo's shut gates and were hauled up over the walls by knotted clothing, and that Pharaoh's own troops, instead of storming in on their heels, stopped to plunder the abandoned camp, so that the city held out, and the war required a 7-month siege that one bold assault might have skipped. Even the propaganda of Thutmose III, in other words, had room for the truth that soldiers are human. Megiddo fell. The coalition's princes crawled, in the record's phrase, on their bellies to kiss the ground, and Thutmose, in a stroke of statecraft as shrewd as the pass at Megiddo, did not execute them. He confirmed them, one by one, in their cities, as vassals, and took their sons home to Egypt, hostages raised in the palace as Egyptian gentlemen, educated beside the royal children, so that a generation later the thrones of Canaan and Syria were filled by princes who had grown up loyal, or at least accustomed, to Egypt, which is empire run not by garrisons but by school ties, and it worked with topping up for over a century. 16 more campaigns followed across the next 2 decades. The frontier pushed to the Euphrates itself, and the treasure and tribute of it all poured into Karnak, and modern historians reaching for a comparison have called Thutmose III the Napoleon of Egypt, a label worth keeping mostly for the pleasure of noting, as more than one Egyptologist has, that Thutmose fought more campaigns than Napoleon, lost none of them, and died in his bed in the 54th year of his reign, counting, with a bookkeeping that would have made any scribe proud, the years of his aunt's rule inside his own. The magnificent stillness. The empire the general built, his great-grandson got to enjoy, and the reign of Amenhotep III, roughly the 1380s BC and onward, is the point of balance of the whole new kingdom, the long golden afternoon at the top of the arc. Nearly 4 decades in which Egypt fought, in effect, nobody, because there was nobody left to fight, only to manage, and the management was conducted in gold. We can watch it happening, in one of the luckiest survivals in all of ancient history, because a cache of the actual diplomatic correspondence of this age was found in the ruins of a later capital. Hundreds of clay tablets in Babylonian cuneiform, the international language of the day, letters between Pharaoh and the kings of Babylon, Assyria, Mitanni, the Hittites, Cyprus, and the anxious mayors of the vassal cities, and the great kings write to each other across all that distance and all those centuries, exactly like relatives at a difficult holiday, addressing each other as brother, haggling over dowries, complaining that the last shipment of gold was short, that the messenger has been detained too long, that a proper brother would have sent more, while the little vassal mayors write upward in tones of increasingly desperate flattery. 7 times and 7 times I fall at the feet of my lord, the king, my son. Amenhotep III married into half these royal houses, took a Mitannian princess with a caravan of hundreds of attendants, and yet the letters make equally clear that when a foreign king asked for an Egyptian princess in return, he was refused flatly, because from of old, as the reply put it, no daughter of the king of Egypt is given to anyone. Gold flowed out, brides flowed in, nothing so valuable as an Egyptian ever left. At home, the king built on a scale not seen since the Pyramid Age, an enormous pleasure palace complex on the Theban West Bank with an artificial lake for the royal barge, a mortuary temple of which the chief survivors are the 2-seated colossi of the king, 60 feet high, that still sit in the fields facing the sunrise, and beside him through all of it, on the monuments, in the letters, named and honored to a degree no king's wife had been before, his queen, Tia, a commoner's daughter raised to something close to co-ruler, whose intelligence foreign kings acknowledged in writing, one of them, after her husband's death, telling her son in so many words, "Your mother knows all the words that pass between your father and me. Ask your mother." Hold on to Tai, and hold on to that son, because the stillness at the top of the ark is exactly that, the top of the ark, and the son of Amenhotep III and Tai is about to attempt the strangest thing any pharaoh ever attempted, which is to overthrow, single-handedly, the accumulated religion of 2,000 years, the heretic. He came to the throne as Amenhotep IV, a younger son never expected to rule, raised in the most opulent court on earth, in the shadow of his golden father and his formidable mother, and within a handful of years of his accession, he had begun the revolution that still, 34 centuries later, has scholars arguing at conferences with a heat usually reserved for living politics. The traditional religion of Egypt, as we have seen all night, was a crowd, hundreds of gods, thousands, great state gods and little household ones, each with temples and priesthoods and festivals, the whole system, presided over in this age by Amun of Thebes, whose temple establishment at Karnak had grown, on the tribute of empire, into something like a state within the state, its high priests controlling land and granaries and labor, on a scale rivaling the crown itself. And it may be, though the sources never say it outright, that part of what happened next was simply an old story wearing new robes, a king moving against the one institution rich enough to check him. But if it began as politics, it did not stay politics. The young king fixed his devotion on one god only, and not even one of the great anthropomorphic gods, but the most abstract thing in the Egyptian sky, the Aten, the visible disk of the sun itself, portrayed not as man or beast, but as a plain circle raying down long, thin beams, each beam ending in a small human hand, reaching down to touch the king and his family, offering them the little hieroglyph of life. In the 5th year of the reign, he changed his name. From Amenhotep, Amun is content, to Akhenaten, effective for the Aten. And then he did something no pharaoh in 17 dynasties had done. He left. Left Thebes, left Memphis, left every established center with its every established priesthood, and in the middle of Egypt, on a virgin crescent of desert on the east bank where, he declared, the Aten had indicated its wish, he built a new capital from nothing, Akhetaten, the horizon of the Aten, laying out its boundary markers himself, swearing in carved inscriptions never to extend the city beyond them, and within perhaps a decade, A city of tens of thousands stood where there had been sand, palaces, villas, workshops, and temples of a kind Egypt had never seen. For the temples of the Aten had no dim inner sanctuary, no cult statue in the holy darkness. They were open courts, roofless, flooded with the god himself, sunlight. And then, with the court transplanted, the revolution turned, as revolutions do, from building to breaking. The other gods were not merely demoted, but increasingly denied, their temples starved or shut, their priesthoods dispersed, and squads of workmen were sent through the whole country, into every temple and every tomb, up every monument with chisels, to cut out the name of Amun wherever it stood, even inside the cartouche of the king's own dead father, even the detail that measures the thoroughness, at the tops of obelisks and in the dark of sealed chambers where no living eye would ever check the work. Egyptologists resist carefully, calling the Aten cult the first monotheism. The king and his family, it seems, worshipped the Aten while the population was expected to worship the king, and the fine distinctions keep the journals full. But whatever its correct label, it was something genuinely new under the sun, an exclusive, intolerant, aggressively enforced devotion to a single god, centuries before anything comparable survives from anywhere else on earth. And it came joined to a hymn, preserved in the tombs of the new city, the great hymn to the Aten, a poem of real and unsettling beauty, in which the one god makes the chick cry in the shell and appoints every man his place, and every foreign land its river, and whose resemblance in structure and image to the 104th Psalm, composed centuries later, has been noticed by essentially everyone who has ever read both, with explanations ranging from direct inheritance to common poetic stock, and the honest answer, as so often tonight, being that no one knows. The art of the rain changed as radically as the religion, and it is through the art that this strange family reaches us most directly. Egyptian royal art had spent 2,000 years perfecting a serene, idealized, essentially timeless formula, and Akhenaten's sculptors, on what can only have been his orders, shattered it, portraying the king with a long drooping face, full lips, a narrow chest, wide womanly hips and a swollen belly, a body so peculiar that early Egyptologists reached for medical diagnoses, glandular disorders, genetic syndromes, a whole literature of retrospective pathology, while the current scholarly lean is that the strangeness was theology, not anatomy. The king as vessel of a god who was mother and father of all things, portrayed as neither quite man nor quite woman, though here too no one knows. And beside the strange king, everywhere, appears his queen, Nefertiti, whose name means the beautiful one has come, shone at a prominence no queen had ever approached, not even Tae, offering to the Aten in her own right, wearing her own unique crown, and, in one astonishing carved block, smiting Egypt's enemies in the classic pose reserved since Narmer for the king alone. And the family scenes, this is the true revolution, show what no pharaoh had ever allowed to be shown. Intimacy, the king and queen kissing their small daughters, dandling them on their knees, holding hands, grieving in one shattering relief over the deathbed of a child, the rays of the Aten reaching down into the private sorrow. Whatever else Akhenaten was, and the options historians have seriously proposed run from visionary mystic to totalitarian founder. He presided over the only moment in 3,000 years when Egyptian art was permitted to show a royal family simply loving each other. And it is no accident that the single most famous object from the reign, and one of the most famous from the whole ancient world, is a portrait of Nefertiti, the painted limestone bust found abandoned in the ruins of a sculptor's workshop in the Dead City, one eye never finished, serene, symmetrical, alive, gazing out of her museum case today at crowds who stand in line, 34 centuries on, to be looked through by a woman whose world was already, at the moment the portrait was made, quietly falling apart. Because it was falling apart. The Amarna letters, Those clay tablets we opened in the last age continue right through this reign, and they document, from the vassal's side, an empire drifting while its master perfected a liturgy. The mayors of the Canaanite cities writing again and again, with rising panic, that rivals are seizing their towns, that the king's territories are being lost to the king, that if no archers come this year, my lord, the land is lost. And the archers, so far as the record shows, mostly did not come. Plague, meanwhile, the letters and later Hittite records agree, was moving through the Near East, and there are indications it reached Egypt itself, and deaths begin to thin the crowded family scenes at Akhetaten. Daughters vanishing from the reliefs, then Nefertiti herself vanishing from the record in circumstances so unclear that scholars cannot agree whether she died, fell from favor, or, in the most tantalizing theory, changed her name and ruled, briefly, as Pharaoh herself, one of the shadowy, grammatically female royal names that flicker in the documents of the reign's confused end. And then, around 1336 BC, after 17 years on the throne, Akhenaten died of what we do not know, and the revolution, which had been in truth a revolution of one, died with him almost at once, and the throne of the greatest empire on earth descended, after the briefest of shadowy interludes, onto the head of a boy of about 9 years old, a son of Akhenaten, most Egyptologists now hold, by a lesser wife, a child with a club foot, a cleft palate, and, thanks to an ancestry of royal inbreeding, the frail constitution of a line folded too many times upon itself. And this boy, married in childhood to his own half-sister, one of Nefertiti's daughters, had been given at birth the name Tutankhaten, living image of the Aten, and within a few years of his accession, as the old priesthoods rose from the ground where his father had thrown them and the court traded the dead sun's city back for Thebes and Memphis, the boy's name was corrected, publicly, pointedly, to the form under which, by the strangest accident in all of archaeology, the entire modern world would come to know him. Tutankhamun, the boy king. Let us be honest about the reign first, because the gold has a way of blinding everyone. Tutankhamun ruled for about 9 years and died at about 19, and the actual governing of those years was done by grown men around the throne, above all the elderly courtier Ai, who held the title God's father and may have been Nefertiti's own father, and the general Horemheb, commander of the armies, and the great act of the reign, carved on a stone now called the Restoration Stela, was the formal undoing of everything the boy's own father had done. The temples reopened and re-endowed, the priesthoods restored, the images of the gods recast in gold, the text describing, in words meant to close an era, how the temples had lain waste, and the gods had turned their backs upon Egypt, and if a man prayed, no god answered. The dead city at Akhetaten emptied within a generation, its mud-brick palaces melting back into the plain, which is precisely why its ruins, and Nefertiti's bust, and the diplomatic archive survived for us, abandonment being, for archaeology, a kind of mercy. And then, around 1327 BC, the young king died, suddenly enough that his tomb was not ready, and how he died has become one of the great parlor games of Egyptology, the skull damage that launched decades of murder theories turning out, on better imaging, to be embalmers' and excavators' work. The current least bad reconstruction resting on a badly broken leg shortly before death, perhaps from a chariot accident. The boy's own tomb was provisioned with well over 100 walking sticks, several showing wear, compounded by malaria, whose parasites have been identified in his tissue. A frail, lame, malarial teenager, in short, whom one bad fall could kill, though it must be said, in the tradition of this long night, that no one knows, and no one ever will. He was buried in haste, in a small tomb almost certainly meant for someone else, possibly for Ai, who took the throne, and the paint on the burial chamber wall was, the microbiologists tell us, not fully dry when the chamber was sealed, leaving spots of mold that survive to this day, and the treasures of the interrupted Amarna line were packed in around him in stacked confusion, And among them, this is the detail I would keep, of everything in that glittering hoard. Someone laid on the boy's coffin a small wreath of wildflowers, cornflowers, and olive leaves, and blue lotus. Flowers that bloom in Egypt in the spring, which is one of the ways we know the season he was buried, and which was, whatever else it was, somebody's goodbye. Then the tomb was sealed, and the entrance buried, and within 2 centuries the flood debris of the valley and the huts of later tomb workers lay over the spot, and the little king, his name soon chiseled out of the public record along with the whole embarrassing Amarna interlude by Horemheb, who followed and closed the dynasty, was forgotten. Absolutely, completely forgotten. And here the story of Tutankhamun simply stops, for 3,250 years, like a held breath, and I am going to leave it held, exactly where the ancient world left it, under the rubble of the valley floor. Because the release of that breath belongs to another century entirely, and it will find its place near the end of our night. The luck of the boy king was terrible in life. It was about to become, on a time scale no one in this story could imagine, the greatest luck in the history of archaeology, and it happened for the humblest reason imaginable, that his tomb was small and cheap and in the way. And everyone stopped being able to find it. The repairman and the machinery of empire. Between the boy king's sealed door and the age of Ramesses, there stands a figure history has never quite decided how to reward, and his story is worth a few quiet minutes because it is the story of how a state heals. Horemheb had risen through the army from origins so modest that his family is essentially invisible to us, had commanded Egypt's forces under Tutankhamun, had waded through the brief reign of Old Eye, and had then taken the throne himself. A king with no royal blood whatsoever, legitimized by marriage, by the army, and by the oracle of Amun, which declared for him at festival the shoulders of the porters, we may assume, reading the needs of the hour correctly. And what he did with the crown was, by the standards of usurpers in every age, remarkable. He did not launch wars of glory. He repaired. His great surviving monument is not a colossus, but a legal text. A long edict carved on stone at Karnak, cataloging, with the specificity of a man who had clearly seen every abuse he names, the corruptions that had flourished in the disorder of the Amarna years and after, soldiers requisitioning boats and slaves from private citizens, officials seizing hides and cargoes under color of tax, courts for sale, and decreeing, item by item, the penalties, which were not gentle, and the reforms, reorganized courts with paid judges under royal inspection, because a judiciary that must feed itself will feed itself, and the whole document breathes a spirit so unexpected in a military strongman that historians keep circling back to it, the spirit of a man who had concluded that the real enemy of Egypt was not the Hittites but the erosion of ordinary fairness, that Mat, that first word of our night, lived or died not at Kadesh, but at the village landing where a farmer either kept his boat or lost it to a sergeant. Horemheb reigned long, restored much, erased, as we have seen, the whole Amarna line from the record with bureaucratic thoroughness, counting his own reign as beginning directly after Amenhotep III, as if the heresy had simply never occurred, and, having no son, did the last responsible thing and chose as heir his old comrade in arms, an elderly general and vizier from the Delta named Ramesses, who reigned briefly as the first of that name, and whose son Seti and grandson Ramesses II would make the name immortal. It is the quietest succession story in Egyptian history, power passed from a childless repairman to a competent friend, no murders, no chaos, and it deserves telling for exactly that reason, because history books, like news broadcasts, are biased toward the burning buildings, and the survival of civilizations depends at least as much on the Horemhebs, the unglamorous administrators who show up after the fire with a ledger and a level and begin. Seti, the sun, is the great connoisseur's pharaoh, the one Egyptologists mention with a particular softening of the voice, and 2 of his works explain why. In the temple he raised at Abydos, the holy city of Osiris, the carved reliefs reach a delicacy that Egyptian art had never touched before and never touched again. Faces in creamy limestone cut so finely that the shadows themselves seem painted, and in a corridor of that temple, Seti had carved a document that is one of Egyptology's foundation stones. The king list of Abydos, Seti, and his young son Rameses, shown reading aloud the names of 76 royal ancestors, from Menes at the head of the line down to Seti himself, the entire authorized memory of Egypt in one wall. And the word authorized is doing work in that sentence, for the list silently omits Hatshepsut, omits Akhenaten and his whole line, omits the boy Tutankhamun, history as the 19th dynasty needed it to have been. And Egyptologists prize the wall doubly, once for what it preserves and once for what its silences confess. And in the Valley of the Kings, Seti cut the deepest, longest, most magnificently decorated tomb of the entire royal necropolis. Its astronomical ceiling a map of the night sky with the constellations drawn as gods and beasts processing through the dark. And his mummy, recovered from the great cache where the priests had hidden him beside his son, is by common consent the finest in existence, a lean, aquiline, serene old man whom the embalmers so honored with their craft that photographs of his face are regularly mistaken, at first glance, for sculpture. The son would build bigger, the father built better, and knew it, and the two facts together tell you most of what you need to know about the difference between the reigns. Since we are marching with this dynasty toward the great collision at Kadesh, it is the natural moment to ask what marching actually meant, because the army of the new kingdom was one of the most elaborate institutions of the ancient world, and we know it from the inside, from the soldiers' own school texts and the campaign accounts. It was a professional force now, no longer the seasonal levies of the Pyramid Age, organized in divisions of 5,000 named for the great gods, Amun, Ra, Ptah, Set, each division a small marching city with its scribes, and everything, this being Egypt, was written down. The enrollments, the ration issues, bread, onions, and the rest, the requisitions, the daybooks of the march. The glamour arm was the chariotry, the two-horse, two-man light chariots adopted from the Hyksos and perfected, driver and archer, the strike force of every battle narrative, and the sports cars of aristocratic youth. And the muscle was the infantry, spear and shield, and the bronze sickle sword, filled increasingly, as the imperial centuries passed, with foreign professionals, Nubian archers above all, whose land had supplied Egypt's best bowmen since the beginning of the story, and, after the wars of the Sea Peoples, whole regiments of the very migrants Egypt had defeated, hired on as marines and palace guards, yesterday's invasion becoming tomorrow's payroll, in the way of empires always. Order behind the lines belonged to a corps whose name deserves rescue from the footnotes, the Medjay, originally a people of the Nubian desert famed as scouts, and trackers, whose name became, by the New Kingdom, the word for the police themselves, the patrols who walked the cemetery cliffs at Thebes and guarded the workmen's valley, so that when the tomb robbery scandals broke, it was Medjay testimony that filled the court records, the ancient world's night watchmen, speaking to us from the transcripts in the oldest voice of their profession. I heard, I followed, I found. And because the scribal schools ran on rivalry, the schoolboy texts preserved the infantry's life as the scribes gleefully caricatured it, the recruit beaten like papyrus, marching on bread and brackish water with his gear on his back. The wounded man carried home, says one exercise, like a sack. Abandon the soldier's life, concludes every one of these compositions, and be a scribe. And the caricature is propaganda, and the mud and the rations and the weight of the pack are not. And between the general's stella and the schoolboy's satire, we can hold, for one more vanished institution, both ends of the truth. One more door deserves opening before we rejoin the kings, and it opens off every corridor of this story, because we have walked past 10,000 square yards of painted wall tonight and have not yet asked the question every museum visitor asks, quietly, a little embarrassed within the first 5 minutes. Why did they draw like that? Why the sideways faces with the forward-looking eye, the shoulders squared to us while the hips and legs walk away, the pond seen from above with the fish seen from the side, and the embarrassed question is in fact the profound one. And the answer transforms the way you see everything in Egypt, because the answer is that Egyptian artists were not trying and failing to show how things look. They were succeeding completely at something else, showing what things are. A face is most itself in profile, but an eye is an oval with a center, so the true eye sits in the true face. Shoulders are a breadth, hips are a pivot. Each is rendered from its own most truthful angle, and the figure assembled from the parts. Less a snapshot than a diagram of a person. And this was the right choice. Deliberately maintained for 3,000 years against every temptation, because the walls were not decoration. They were, as we saw long ago in the tombs, machinery, images meant to become real in eternity. And if your painting of a servant grinding grain is going to feed a soul forever, you do not want a moody impression of a servant. You want the complete, unambiguous, fully specified fact of one, every limb accounted for, nothing hidden by perspective's accidents, built on measured grids of 18 squares to the standing figure so that correctness could be taught, checked, and repeated for 100 generations. Egyptian art is engineering drawing for the afterlife, and once you see it that way, you will never again see it as stiff. You will see it as certain, and you will notice, with a small shock, that the system could relax when it chose, that the pharaoh is always shown in the timeless diagram, but the dancing girls at the banquet turn their faces full toward us, breaking every rule, because they are not eternal machinery. They are Tuesday night, and the draftsman knew the difference, and drew, for one figure in 50, exactly what he saw. Those breaches in the code, a turned face here, an old harpist's belly there, a sleeping herdsman under a tree in the corner of a harvest scene, are the places where, for 3,000 years, the artists initialed the work. And when you find one, in a museum or a book or a tomb, you are shaking hands across the grid with a particular person on a particular afternoon, which is, as this whole night keeps discovering, the only immortality that ever actually functioned. The Great Showman. The dynasty that followed the Amarna wreckage was founded by soldiers, practical northern military men who set about repairing the empire with unsentimental competence. And its third king is the pharaoh against whom, fairly or not, all other pharaohs are measured. The one whose name has become shorthand for the whole institution. Ramesses II, Ramesses the Great, came to the throne around 1279 BC as a young man in his early 20s. Red-haired, from a family that seems to have carried the trait, and he proceeded to reign for 66 years. Father, by his principal and secondary wives, somewhere in the neighborhood of 100 children, a number historians repeat with the caution it deserves, and the sources nonetheless insist upon, and to stamp his name on more surface area of Egypt than any ruler before or since, partly by prodigious genuine building and partly by the more economical method, which his masons applied with industrial cheerfulness, of carving his cartouche over the names on other kings' monuments, cutting it on his own buildings, so deep into the stone that no future king could do the same to him. The centerpiece of the legend, and the event that shows us the whole man, came early in his 5th year, at a Syrian city called Kadesh, where the empire of Egypt and the empire of the Hittites, the great rival power of Anatolia, collided in what may have been the largest chariot battle ever fought. Thousands of chariots on the field between them. The short, honest version of Kadesh is that Ramesses was deceived and ambushed, told by 2 captured nomads, planted, it turned out, by the Hittite king, that the enemy was far away. He pushed ahead with only the leading quarter of his army and made camp, whereupon the entire Hittite chariot force, which had been waiting concealed on the far side of the city, crossed the river and smashed into his marching 2nd Division, and then into the camp itself, and the king of Egypt found himself encircled in the wreckage with his household troops, his shield-bearer, and, the inscriptions specify, his pet lion. And here, even the skeptical historians concede the young man genuinely fought like something out of legend, leading charge after charge in person until relief columns, one arriving providentially along the coast road, stabilized the field into a bloody, exhausted draw. Both armies withdrew. Kadesh stayed Hittite. and Rameses went home and declared it the greatest victory in the history of the world, and had the poem and the reliefs of his single-handed triumph. The king alone against thousands, carved on temple walls the length of Egypt, at least 7 major sites, where tourists read them still. History's most successful press release. But the true ending of the story is better than the propaganda, and it deserves to be rescued from it, because some 15 years of Cold War later, Egypt and the Hittites, both eyeing the rising menace of Assyria further east, did something no two great powers had ever done. They signed a peace treaty, a full formal parity treaty between equals, non-aggression, mutual defense, extradition of fugitives with a remarkable clause requiring that extradited persons and their families not be punished, and this document survives from both sides, the Egyptian version carved at Karnak, the Hittite version on clay tablets from their capital's archives, each king in his own copy, politely implying the other had asked first, and it held, unbroken, for the rest of both empires' overlapping existence, sealed eventually by Ramesses' marriage to a Hittite princess, and a copy of it hangs today as the oldest surviving international peace treaty in the world, on the wall of the United Nations building in New York, which means the Peace of Kadesh is, in a sense, still on duty. And the buildings, one must give the showman his due. The buildings are astonishing. The Great Hall at Karnak completed, a whole new Delta capital, Pi-Ramesses, of turquoise-tiled palaces, his memorial temple at Thebes, and above all, far south in Nubia, the temple of Abu Simbel, cut entirely into a sandstone cliff, fronted by 4-seated colossi of the king 65 feet high, and oriented with such precision that twice a year, on dates in February and October, the rising sun shoots down the entire length of the interior corridor to illuminate the statues of the gods, and the king among them, seated in the innermost sanctuary in the heart of the mountain. Beside his own temple, he cut a second, smaller one for his beloved principal wife Nefertari, she for whom the sun shines, whose painted tomb in the Valley of the Queens is by common consent the most beautiful in Egypt. And on the facade at Abu Simbel, her colossus stands the same height as the king's, an honor without parallel. And there is one more thing to say about Abu Simbel, out of order and worth it. In the 1960s, when the new high dam at Aswan was about to drown all of Lower Nubia under an artificial lake, an international rescue effort under the United Nations cut both temples, colossi, corridors, sanctuaries, and all into more than 1,000 numbered blocks, some weighing 30 tons, and reassembled them, seam by seam, on higher ground 200 feet up the cliff, inside artificial mountains built to receive them, so that the sun still enters on the appointed mornings, and 50 nations paid for it. And if you want a single image for what Ramesses won in the end, it is that one, the whole quarrelsome modern world taxing itself to move his mountain, rather than let his name go under the water. Ramesses outlived everything. He outlived Nefertari. He outlived the Hittite War and the Hittite Peace. He outlived 12 of his own crown princes, being succeeded eventually by his 13th son, already an old man himself. And when Ramesses died at last, past 90, there can have been almost no one alive in Egypt who remembered a world without him, and the mummy of this most durable of kings has had, fittingly, the most durable of afterlives, moved by anxious priests from hiding place to hiding place in the troubles that followed, found in the great royal cache in the modern era, an aged, hawk-nosed man with, still visible, the fine red hair, and flown, in 1976, to Paris for conservation treatment, on which occasion, the story goes, he was issued an Egyptian passport listing his occupation as king, deceased, and received at the airport with the honors due a visiting head of state. And while the passport itself has grown in the telling, as such stories do, the state reception was real, and there is something almost unbearably Egyptian about the whole affair. A civilization that spent 3,000 years arranging for its kings to travel safely after death would, of course, end up putting one on an airplane, the village of the makers. Now let us leave the colossi for a while, because directly across the river from all that imperial thunder, tucked in a desert hollow on the Theban west bank, sat a small walled village of perhaps 68 houses, and I want to spend real time there, for of all the places in Egypt, this one, called in its own day the place of truth and known now as Deir el-Medina, is where the ancient world comes closest enough to touch. This was the purpose-built home of the royal tomb makers, the hereditary crews of quarrymen, draftsmen, sculptors, and painters who cut and decorated the tombs in the Valley of the Kings, state employees of the most sensitive kind, housed together partly to keep them close to the work, and partly, one assumes, to keep the location of the king's eternity inside one set of walls, paid by the state in grain, fish, water, firewood, and beer, with bonuses at festivals. And because the village stood in absolute desert, and because its people were, uniquely for a working community in the ancient world, largely literate, the sand has given us their paperwork, tens of thousands of scraps, notes, and receipts and letters jotted on limestone flakes and broken pottery. And through that paperwork, we know these particular ordinary people of 32 centuries ago better than we know any other community in antiquity, and arguably better than we know most villages of medieval Europe. We know their attendance registers, the foreman's daybook recording, who missed work and why, and the reasons are eternal: ill, scorpion stung, eye trouble, brewing beer, which was a legitimate religious duty and clearly a popular one, embalming his mother. His daughter was bleeding, simply lazy. The register does not spare, and one workman, Peneb, a gifted, appalling man whose full charge sheet survives, stands accused across several documents of theft from the royal tomb itself, of threats against his foreman, and of an energetic adultery that scandalized even this unshockable village, the ancient world's most complete personnel file. And he seems, infuriatingly, to have kept his job for years, which will surprise no one who has ever worked anywhere. We know they moonlighted, making coffins and furniture for private clients on the side, with workshop price lists. We know they went to law constantly, before a village tribunal of their own neighbors, over donkeys hired and not returned, over walls, over inheritances, and that when the tribunal disappointed them, they appealed over its head to the deified ghost of a former king by putting yes and no questions to his statue as it was carried past on festival days. We know their dreams mattered enough to pay for, because dream interpretation manuals survive. If a man sees himself in a dream looking out of a window good, it means his call will be heard. And in the 29th year of Ramesses III, a couple of generations after the great Ramesses, the village wrote itself into the largest kind of history, because the grain wages fell weeks into arrears. The empire by then being squeezed in ways we will come to shortly. And the tomb crews, the pharaoh's own most trusted workmen, did something for which no earlier word exists in any language. They put down their tools, marched out of the desert, and sat down inside the memorial temple complexes on the plain, saying, the record quotes them, "We are hungry. 18 days have passed of the month," and refused to work until they were paid. It is the first recorded labor strike in human history. It is in the strict sense older than money, wages being loaves and grain. And the most remarkable thing about it is that it worked. The officials scrambled, the back rations appeared, and when the arrears recurred, the village struck again, and a scribe of the crew named Amenacht stood in the gate arguing the men's case to the administration, the first shop steward whose name we know. I linger in this village deliberately, and not only for the pleasure of it. Every golden object in this story, every colossus and painted paradise, was made by hands. And Deir el-Medina is the one place on earth where we can watch the hands, quarreling, brewing, dreaming, striking, and then walking up the cliff path on Monday morning, such as Mondays were, to carve eternity for somebody else, on wages. And it is worth saying plainly that when the workmen of this village painted the field of reeds on a king's wall, the perfected farms, the family restored, the beer that never runs out, they were painting their own hopes, at their own price. And the price is in the ledger, and the hopes are on the wall. And between those two documents lies most of what I know how to say about civilization. The world breaks again. The empire that missed the village's payroll was not being careless. It was being strangled, and by forces far larger than Egypt, because we have now reached, in the wider story of the ancient world, one of its greatest and most genuinely mysterious catastrophes. Somewhere around 1200 BC, within roughly a single lifetime, the entire interconnected civilization of the Eastern Mediterranean, the brotherhood of great kings, the palaces of Mycenaean Greece, the merchant cities of the Levant coast, the Hittite Empire itself, all of it, went down. Palaces burned and never rebuilt, cities abandoned, writing systems in some regions simply forgotten, trade routes severed, and historians call it the Late Bronze Age collapse and argue without end about its causes, the ingredient list including a run of severe drought years now visible in the climate record. Earthquakes, the breakdown of the elaborate interdependent trade in copper and tin on which every bronze economy depended, internal revolts, and, moving through all of it, both symptom and accelerant, masses of displaced, armed, migrating people, whole populations on the move by land and sea with their families and ox carts, looking for somewhere that still had grain, and the Egyptian records, with characteristic bureaucratic precision, name the groups of these migrants who came at Egypt, a shifting confederacy scholars call the Sea Peoples, and one of the named contingents, the Peliset, settling afterward on the coast of Canaan, would give their name to the Philistines of the Bible, which is a measure of how directly this ancient catastrophe drains into history we still argue about. Twice they came at Egypt in force, and twice Egypt, alone of all the great powers, held. The second time under Rameses III, around 1177 BC, in a battle fought in the very mouths of the delta, the Egyptians lining the banks with archers and grappling the migrant fleet into a killing zone in the river channels. And the reliefs of it at the king's temple of Medinet Habu are the best pictures of naval combat the ancient world ever made. Capsizing ships, drowning men. The ox carts and families of the land column shone with a documentary honesty that makes the modern viewer flinch, because these were, visibly, not simply armies. And Egypt's victory, complete as it was the victory of the last building standing in a burned district. The world Egypt had been a great power and no longer existed. There were no more brother kings to write to. The gold road south had grown unreliable, the grain strained, and the reign of the victorious Rameses III himself dissolves into the unmistakable signs of a system failing from within. The first strikes in history, as we have seen, at Deir el-Medina, and then, at the end, a conspiracy inside the royal harem itself. A lesser wife scheming to put her son on the throne, and the trial records survive, dry as ever, listing the accused, the verdicts, the permissions granted to several highly placed conspirators to take their own lives, and for centuries historians debated whether the plot had actually reached the old king, until scanning of his mummy settled it with terrible finality, finding beneath the bandages a cut throat, back to the spine, and an amulet of healing placed with dreadful tenderness in the wound by the embalmers. The king died, the son the plotters backed did not inherit. The state ground on, but the great days were done, and the last century of the new kingdom reads like a long dimming afternoon. Weak kings in the north, the high priests of Amun ruling the south in all but name, prices rising, and then, most telling of all, the tomb robberies. No longer furtive but organized. The workmen and officials of the necropolis itself, the heirs of the place of truth, mining the valley they had built. And the transcripts of the robbery trials survived too. Confessions extracted and recorded. We opened their coffins and their wrappings, and found the noble mummy of the king with a long chain of gold amulets. We stripped the gold from him, and we set fire to the wrappings, and the priests of Amun, unable to stop the mining, finally surrendered to it in the most Egyptian way imaginable, gathering the violated kings out of their tombs, rewrapping them, labeling each one in dockets of neat hieratic, and hiding them by night in a handful of secret caches, in one of which, a cliff shaft near Deir el-Bahri, Ramesses the Great and Second Enra of the Old War of Liberation and dozens more would sleep, stacked together like documents in storage, for very nearly 3,000 years until, near the end of our story, a family of modern tomb robbers, following a goat, or so the tale is told, would find the shaft, and the kings of Egypt would come out of the mountain one last time and sail downriver to Cairo past banks where villagers stood, the report has it, wailing and firing guns into the air, mourning or saluting. It was not entirely clear even to those present. The oldest dead in the world. The old country. Before we walk down into the final act, into the divided centuries and the foreign crowns and the last queen, it is worth pausing on the threshold to notice something that had quietly become true of Egypt by this late hour of its history. Something with no parallel anywhere else in the ancient world. Egypt had become old. Not old the way every country is old, but old in its own full knowledge. A civilization that could stand inside its own museum, and its people knew it, and we can watch them knowing it. On the walls of the pyramid precincts of Saqqara, by then more than 1,000 years venerable, visiting scribes of the imperial age left tourist graffiti in tidy hieratic, recording that they had come to stroll in the shadow of the monuments of the ancestors and found them, one writes, as though heaven were within them, dating their visits, naming their offices, adding, in at least one immortal instance, a colleague's scrawled opinion that the previous graffito was the work of a fool, and these little inked notes, sightseers' marks left at monuments already ancient, by people who are themselves now 3,000 years gone, produce a vertigo that no other archaeology quite matches. Antiquity's own antiquity, preserved with the fingerprint still in it. Princes of the royal house made careers of the past. One son of Ramesses II, the Prince Khayyam Waset, spending his life surveying and restoring the crumbling pyramids and labeling each with the recovered name of its owner, conservation notices carved in stone, so that Egyptologists, with entire justice, have called him the first Egyptologist, and later ages remembered him not as an administrator but as a wizard, the hero of magical tales, because a man who spends his days among the tombs of the ancients reading dead men's names must, folk logic reasonably concluded, know things. The Sate kings, as we will shortly see, ran that reverence into a program of state, copying the 2,000-year-old styles until new statues and old could barely be told apart. Egypt spent its last native centuries in conversation with its own deep past, and the tone of the conversation was not decadence, whatever the older textbooks say. It was something more recognizable and more touching. A very old house, still inhabited, whose family had taken, in the evenings, to reading the diaries in the attic. Into this old country, in the 5th century BC, under the Persian occupation, came a tourist with a scroll, and since we have leaned on him all night, it is time he had his scene. Herodotus of Halicarnassus, a Greek with an inexhaustible curiosity and an unimprovable narrative instinct, spent some months in Egypt gathering material for his histories, traveling, by his own account, as far south as Aswan, interviewing priests through interpreters, pacing off monuments, and writing it all down, the reliable and the preposterous side by side with equal relish, and the result, the second book of his histories, is the oldest surviving outsider's portrait of Egypt, and one of the most influential books ever written about anywhere. He is the reason the world believed for millennia that the pyramids were built by whipped slaves, an error we have already corrected in his company. He is also the reason we possess priceless truths, the 70-day embalming and its price tiers, the crocodiles adorned with golden earrings in the temple pools, the mourning customs, the shaved eyebrows for a dead cat, because on matters he could see with his own eyes he is repeatedly, verifiably right, and on matters reported to him by guides 2,000 years downstream of the facts he is magnificently, quotably wrong, and he usually, this is his charm and his sanity, tells you which is which, flagging what he saw apart from what he was told, adding, after the tallest tales, that he himself does not believe it but sets it down as he heard it, which is, when you think about it, a working definition of intellectual honesty that plenty of later centuries failed to meet. Standing at the immense granite monuments, being told by the priests of the 341 generations of their records, the Greek did the arithmetic against his own people's 400-year-old heroic age and experienced, visibly, on the page, the sensation every visitor to Egypt has reported since, the floor of time dropping away beneath him. And he coined, in trying to say what the country was, the phrase we opened this entire night with, the gift of the river, so that our story's first sentence and its last act turn out to have the same author, a tourist with a scroll, being lied to cheerfully by professional guides, getting the big thing exactly right. And it was in these same late centuries that Egypt's oldest habit of heart, the companionship with animals we saw in the household long ago, swelled into the strangest and most industrial of all its religious expressions, and no honest portrait of the old country can leave it out. The logic ran like this, that if a god could inhabit a statue, a god could inhabit a creature, and so certain single animals, above all the Apis bull of Memphis, black with particular white markings, were sought through all Egypt, enthroned in the temple, consulted as oracles, mourned at death like kings, and buried, embalmed, in granite sarcophagi of up to 80 tons in an underground gallery called the Serapeum. Generation of bulls after generation of bulls, and when the French archaeologist Auguste Mariette, following a half-remembered line of an ancient geographer and a row of half-buried sphinxes, blasted his way into that gallery in 1851, he found the great vaults, the colossal coffins, and, in one chamber, undisturbed dust, holding the footprints of the last priests who had walked out one afternoon 2,500 years earlier, and by his own account the discoverer stood a long time looking at the footprints, which is the correct response, and the only one. From the single sacred animal, late piety expanded to the species entire, and the numbers stopped the breath. Pilgrims to the shrines of Thoth, the ibis-headed god of writing, could purchase an embalmed ibis as an offering, a prayer with wings, and the galleries at Saqqara and elsewhere have yielded ibis mummies not by the thousand, but by the estimated million, 4 million and more in one complex alone, an entire sacred industry with breeding farms, embalming, workshops, and the excavators found. Its own scandals, a percentage of the neat linen bundles proving, under the scanner, to contain a feather, a bone, or nothing at all, piety outrunning supply, the ancient world's most literal empty promises, and one thinks of the customer, the worried mother or the hopeful scribe, paying for a prayer and carrying it carefully down the gallery steps, and one hopes the god, who was after all the god of accounting, graded the intention and not the contents. Cats above all, in these centuries, were bred at the temples of the cat goddess Bastet by the tens of thousands for the same devotional economy, mummified, coned in linen, painted with little faces, and stacked in catacombs so vast that in the 19th century of our own era, a cargo of some 180,000 ancient cat mummies was shipped from Egypt to Liverpool and sold at auction, ground up for fertilizer, spread on the fields of England, an ending so dreadful and so absurd that one hardly knows which century to be ashamed of. And the auctioneer, the report says, knocked down the lots using an embalmed cat as his gavel, a sentence I promise you is in the record, and which I will allow to stand without one word of commentary, because some facts are their own complete sermon on the reverence of one age and the carelessness of another. So hold this picture of the old country as we go down into the last act, because everything that follows, the divided dynasties, the pious conqueror from the south, the Archasing revival, the Persians, the Greeks, happens inside it, inside a land that had become, to the entire surrounding world, the standard measure of age itself, the place philosophers claim to have studied, the place every new power needed to be blessed by, the attic of the human race and its people, through every occupation and every tax regime, kept on doing what we have watched them do all night, planting on the black land when the water fell, painting the diagram of eternity on the chapel walls, burying prayers with wings in the galleries of the god of writing, and telling anyone who asked, through interpreters, with professional patience and the occasional improvement, the immense, half-remembered, entirely true story of who they had been. The long dimming and the unexpected pharaohs. What follows the New Kingdom, in the conventional tellings, is usually compressed to a paragraph of decline, and the compression is understandable. The Third Intermediate Period, as historians call it, being a genuinely confusing 4 centuries of divided rule, the north governed by kings at Tanis in the Delta, the south by the hereditary high priests of Amun at Thebes, the 2 power blocks intermarrying and coexisting in an arrangement so amiable and so strange that the era's civil wars were mostly conducted by correspondence, and then dynasties of Libyan descent, families of settled soldiers from the western desert grown Egyptian over generations, taking the kingship itself, one of them, Shoshenq, marching into a divided Israel and Judah, and carving at Karnak a list of conquered towns that overlaps, most scholars accept. With the campaign of the king the Bible calls Shishak, plundering the Temple of Solomon in the days of Rehoboam, one of those cold joins where Egyptian stone and scripture touch. But out of this dimming era comes one story that deserves to be told at full length, and almost never is. Far to the south, in Nubia, in the land Egypt had colonized and garrisoned and taxed for 1,000 years, the colony had not forgotten the colonizer's religion, and around 730 BC the king of Kush, a man named Piye, ruling from his southern capital near the holy mountain of Amun at Napata, looked north at an Egypt crumbled into a dozen squabbling principalities, and decided, in effect, that somebody had to save Egypt from the Egyptians. His conquest of the whole country is recorded on a great granite stela in his own words, and it is one of the strangest and most endearing war memorials in history, because Piye presents the campaign as a pilgrimage with battles, pausing his siege operations to celebrate the festivals of Amun at Thebes, requiring his soldiers to purify themselves before fighting, since they fought in the god's name, sparing every city that opened its gates, weeping, or so the stela says, not over the men lost, but upon discovering that the horses in a besieged prince's stable had been starved, a cruelty to horses being, in Piye's stated view, the conquered ruler's most damning offense. And having taken the submission of every Delta princeling, he did the last thing anyone expected. He went home, back to Napata, and never visited Egypt again. His successors stayed, ruling as the 25th dynasty, black pharaohs from the upper Nile governing the whole of Egypt for the better part of a century, and ruling, the record shows, as devout restorers, repairing temples, reviving old scripts and old artistic styles, and, in the most quietly moving gesture in the whole late history of Egypt, reviving the pyramid, dead in Egypt for 800 years, as the royal tomb form of their own homeland, so that in the deserts of what is now Sudan, there stand today more pyramids, small, steep-sided, and numerous, than in all of Egypt itself, the student civilization keeping the teacher's oldest custom long after the teacher had given it up. It could not last, and the reason it could not last was iron, marching from the east, because the Assyrian Empire, the most efficiently brutal military machine the world had yet produced, had absorbed everything between Mesopotamia and the Egyptian border, and in the 660s BC it came on, twice, sacking Memphis, and then doing the thing that sent a shudder through the entire ancient world, sacking Thebes itself, holy, immemorial Thebes, carrying its treasures to Nineveh, an event so notorious that a Hebrew prophet, Nahum, invoked it a generation later as the standard of catastrophe. Are you better than Noaman, that sat by the river, and yet was carried away? The Cushites withdrew forever into their southern kingdom, which endured, pyramid building, literate and independent, for another 1,000 years, one of history's great undertold civilizations, and Egypt learned what it was to be a province. Yet even now, the story refuses to simply descend, because Egypt had one more genuine revival in it. The Assyrians, overstretched, governed through Egyptian client princes, and one of these, Psamtik of the delta city of Sais, quietly converted clientage into independence, And the Sayyid dynasty he founded gave Egypt a final native golden age. A century and a half of prosperity, seaborne trade with the Greek world through a licensed Greek port in the Delta, and a deliberate, systematic, deeply self-aware program of looking backward, artists and scribes copying the styles and texts of the Old Kingdom, 2,000 years gone, with an accuracy that still occasionally fools museum catalogers. A civilization old enough to have a renaissance of itself, running on reverence and archive. It ended on a single afternoon in 525 BC at the Delta's edge, when the army of Persia, the new master of all Asia, broke the Egyptian line, and for most of the next 2 centuries, Egypt was a satrapy of the Persian Empire, the first ruler in its history governing it from somewhere else. The Persian kings enrolled themselves, on paper, as a numbered Egyptian dynasty, some governing with real tact. And the tale every Greek tourist was told, that the conqueror Cambyses had mocked and stabbed the sacred Apis bull, is contradicted by the bull cult's own burial records, which show the animals of his reign dying in their beds with full honors, a reminder, one of many tonight, that history is frequently written by the conquered, and the conquered were furious. Egypt revolted repeatedly, won free for one last flicker of native rule in the 4th century BC. 2 generations of pharaohs, of whom the final one, Nectanebo II, an energetic builder whom the record then simply loses, fleeing south out of history when the Persians stormed back, holds a distinction he never knew, the last native-born Egyptian ever to rule Egypt as pharaoh, a sentence whose weight you only feel when you remember that the institution he closed was, by then, 2,700 years old, the Greek pharaohs. In the autumn of 332 BC, the Persians' own nemesis arrived at the Delta, a 24-year-old Macedonian king who had just dismantled their empire's western half, and Egypt did not resist Alexander, it received him, the Persian governor surrendering without a fight, and the population, by every account, welcoming the young man as a liberator from the hated occupier. And Alexander, whose genius extended to knowing exactly which local gestures cost little and bought everything, did 3 things in his few months on the Nile. He sacrificed, conspicuously, to the Apis bull the Persians were said to have insulted. He made a long, dangerous, entirely unnecessary journey west across the desert, to the remote oracle of Amun at the Siwa oasis, where the priest greeted him, in the manner reserved for pharaohs, as son of the god, a greeting Alexander treasured, deployed, and possibly believed for the rest of his short life. And on the coast, on a limestone ridge between the sea and a lake, he paced out with his own feet, the story insists, sprinkling barley meal to mark the lines when chalk ran short, the street plan of a new city to be called, like a dozen others he founded, but this one above all, Alexandria. Then he marched east to conquer the rest of the world, and never saw it built, dying in Babylon 9 years later, whereupon his generals tore his empire apart, and the shrewdest of them, a childhood friend named Ptolemy, grabbed Egypt, and, in the single most audacious public relations theft of antiquity, hijacked Alexander's funeral cortege on the road and buried the conqueror in Egypt, eventually in Alexandria itself, where the tomb became the new kingdom's founding relic, visited by Caesars for centuries before vanishing at some point in late antiquity, so completely that finding it remains the daydream of every archaeologist who works in that drowned and buried city. The dynasty Ptolemy founded ruled Egypt for very nearly 300 years, and it was, from beginning to end, a strange dual creature, Greek to its bones, speaking Greek at court, wrestling in gymnasia, and simultaneously, on every temple wall from the Delta to Nubia, pharaonic, the Ptolemies portrayed in the immemorial style, crowned, kilted, offering mat to the gods, building, it deserves emphasis, magnificently, many of the temples the modern visitor finds most overwhelming, Edfu, Dendera, Philae, being not ancient Egyptian at all by the reckoning of this story, but Ptolemaic, the final flowering of the old architecture under Greek patrons, and adopting, notoriously, the old royal habit of brother-sister marriage, generation upon generation, with consequences for the family tree and the family temperament that the dynasty's bloody internal history records in detail. And their capital became, within 2 generations, what Thebes and Memphis had each been in their day, the greatest city of the world, and something neither had ever been, the world's brain. The first 2 Ptolemies, determined to buy for their parvenu kingdom the one thing Macedonian spears could not seize, prestige, founded and funded the Mausoleon, the Shrine of the Muses, a state-supported research institution whose fellows, housed, fed, and salaried by the crown, were free simply to think, and its working collection, the Library of Alexandria, conceived with the explicitly totalizing ambition of holding a copy of every book in the world. Ships entering the harbor searched for scrolls, the scrolls copied, the copies, the story goes, returned while the originals stayed. And in that city, over the next 2 centuries, Euclid organized geometry into the textbook that remained the textbook into living memory. Eratosthenes, third librarian, measured the circumference of the earth with a stick, and a shadow. Coming within a few % of the true figure, Aristarchus proposed, 17 centuries before Copernicus, that the earth circles the sun, Herophilus, dissecting, distinguished nerves from vessels and located the mind in the brain. Against Aristotle, and the Hebrew scriptures were put into Greek, the translation through which they would enter the Roman world, and thence everything since. One more Alexandrian, a maker of gadgets named Heron, built a small metal sphere that spun when the water inside it boiled, jetting steam, a toy, a temple amusement, and the first heat engine on Earth. And nothing whatever came of it. The ancient economy running on muscle it saw no reason to replace, and historians have wondered ever since, in the small hours, what the world would look like now if anyone in that city of geniuses had thought the spinning toy worth a second, serious look. Over the harbor, on the island of Pharos, stood the lighthouse, 300 and more feet of stone and fire counted among the 7 wonders. And the measure of its fame is that in a large share of the languages of the Mediterranean world today, the ordinary word for lighthouse is still some form of its name, Pharaoh, fair. The building dissolved by earthquakes 7 centuries ago and surviving as a common noun. It was, all of it, dazzling. And it was also, never forget, a colonial arrangement. Greek Alexandria, feeding on the taxed grain of an Egyptian countryside that the court did not speak to in its own language. And the machine ran down as such machines do. The later Ptolemies feuding, poisoning, and marrying each other in combinations increasingly desperate. The countryside rising in revolts, the dynasty could no longer wholly crush. And behind everything, growing decade by decade like weather on the horizon, the power that now owned the Western Sea, Rome, which propped up the enfeebled dynasty, lent it money, inherited pieces of it by bequest, and waited with the patience of the inevitable, while the kingdom of the Ptolemies dwindled to the status of a very rich, very old estate whose heirs could not pay their debts. And it is into exactly this situation, in 69 BC, that there was born the last character of our long story, a daughter of the failing house, the 7th of her dynasty to carry the name Cleopatra, the last pharaoh. Almost everything the world thinks it knows about Cleopatra arrives filtered through her enemies, the poets and propagandists of the Rome that destroyed her. And the first duty of any honest telling is to set the caricature aside. The historical Cleopatra, so far as the sober sources allow us to see her, was not primarily a seductress, and the ancient writers closest to the facts say as much, one of them remarking that her beauty was, in itself, not incomparable, but that her conversation, her voice, which he compares to a many-stringed instrument, her intelligence, and her presence, were together irresistible. She was a working monarch of formidable ability, educated in the Alexandrian tradition, credited by the sources with speaking somewhere near 9 languages, and among them, This detail says everything. Egyptian, which she was, after nearly 300 years of her own family's rule, the first Ptolemy ever to learn. She managed the currency, the grain fleets, and the famines of a strained kingdom, presented herself to her Egyptian subjects seriously and consistently as the goddess Isis in human form, and pursued from a position of catastrophic weakness, wedged between an insolvent inheritance and an insatiable Rome. The only strategy available, which was to make Egypt so personally indispensable to whoever currently ruled Rome, that swallowing it would feel like self-harm. That the instruments of the policy included the two most powerful men of her age was not incidental, but it was policy, and for 20 years it must be recorded. It worked. Driven from her throne at 21 by her brother-husband's faction, she returned by way of the most famous entrance in history, conveyed secretly into the besieged palace at Alexandria to reach Julius Caesar, rolled, says the tradition, in a carpet, or more probably a bedding sack, unwrapped before the 52-year-old master of the world, and emerging within the season, restored to her throne, and within the year, mother of a son she named Caesarion, Little Caesar. In Rome, where she followed Caesar and was installed, to the scandal of all conservative opinion, in his gardens across the Tiber, the dictator placed a gilded statue of her in the temple of his own ancestral goddess, and then, on the Ides of March of 44 BC, the daggers of the Senate ended that entire future in the time it takes to read this sentence, and Cleopatra took her son and sailed home to wait out the Roman civil war that followed. Out of it came a division of the world, the cold, brilliant heir Octavian taking the west, and the east falling to Caesar's greatest general, Marcus Antonius, Mark Antony, who summoned the Queen of Egypt to answer charges of having aided the assassins, and to whom she answered the summons by sailing up the river to him at Tarsus in a barge with gilded stern and purple sails and silver oars moving to the music of flutes, herself dressed as Aphrodite beneath a spangled canopy, fanned by boys costumed as cupids, so that the whole city emptied to the waterline to stare, and the general was left standing in an abandoned marketplace. And by the end of the week, the charges were forgotten, and the alliance that would decide the fate of the Mediterranean was made. What followed, across the next decade, was politics, and was also, the sources leave little room for doubt, an actual marriage. In everything but Roman law, twins, and then a third child born. The pair wintering in Alexandria, in a society of feasting they named the inimitable livers. Antony granting to Cleopatra and her children, at a ceremony Rome would never forgive, whole provinces of Rome's east, and Octavian, in Rome, forging from every report a weapon, until the inevitable war came, and was decided in September of 31 BC in a naval battle off the western coast of Greece, at Actium, where, at the height of an engagement whose tactics historians still puzzle over, Cleopatra's squadron broke through the line and made sail for Egypt, and Antony, and this the Roman world could neither understand nor pardon, left his own fleet and his own legions and followed her, and it was over. Within the year, Octavian's army stood at Alexandria. Antony, told falsely that the queen was already dead, fell on his sword, and was carried, dying, to the fortified tomb where she had barricaded herself with her treasure, and was drawn up to her through the window by ropes, and died in her arms. Cleopatra, taken alive, endured one interview with Octavian, understood precisely what remained, which was to be marched in golden chains through Rome in his triumph, and 11 days after Antony's death, having been permitted to pour offerings at his tomb, she was found dead upon her golden couch in her full royal regalia, her 2 waiting women dying with her, and the mechanism, whether the famous asp, an Egyptian cobra smuggled to her in a basket of figs, which is the story the world has voted for, or a hidden poison, which several ancient writers thought likelier, was never established. Even Octavian's own investigators, the sources report, finding nothing certain but 2 faint marks upon her arm. She was 39. Octavian, with the thoroughness that was his signature, had Caesarion, the 17-year-old son of Caesar and last king of the line, hunted down and killed on the advice a courtier supplied. That too many Caesars is not a good thing, and Egypt, 3,000 years after Narmer joined the two lands, ceased to be a kingdom and became the private estate of the Roman emperor, its grain fleets feeding Rome's mob, its old temples still building and carving, its new masters enrolled on the walls in the immemorial style as pharaohs. The forms outlived the thing itself for centuries, as forms do. The last datable hieroglyphic inscription anywhere on Earth was carved at the island temple of Philae, far in the south, in 394 AD by a priest of Isis named Nesmeterachem. A graffito, really, a prayer for his father. And within a generation or two, the last temples were closed by imperial decree. The last priests dispersed. And then the unthinkable quiet thing happened. The thing that gives this whole night story its final shape. The knowledge of how to read the writing died. Not the monuments stood, covered in text from horizon to horizon, the most thoroughly labeled civilization in human history. But the key to the labels was gone. Entirely, everywhere. And for the next 1,400 years, the human race walked past the pyramids and the obelisks and the painted tombs in total illiteracy. Guessing, and the guesses, from medieval travelers and Renaissance mystics alike, ran to magic and allegory and buried treasure. And Egypt, the real Egypt, the Egypt of the flood calendars and the workmen's attendance registers and the love songs, was as lost as if the sand had swallowed it whole. It is, if you think about it in the dark, one of the eeriest events in history, and nobody ever decided it. A language 3,500 years old in its written form simply slipped, speaker by speaker, reader by reader, out of the world, and the civilization that had bet everything, from its first dynasty, on the permanence of the written name, lay for a millennium and a half in plain sight, shouting into deaf air, the key under the wall. The finding of the key is the last full story of the night, and it begins, of all ways, with an invasion. Napoleon Bonaparte's expedition to Egypt in 1798, a military adventure that failed completely and changed history anyway, because Napoleon, in the self-conscious manner of a man auditioning for posterity, brought with his army a legion of scholars, engineers, naturalists, and artists, whose surveys of the temples and tombs, published across the following decades in enormous volumes, set off in Europe a fever for Egypt that has never fully broken since. And in the summer of 1799, at a delta fort near the town of Rosetta, French soldiers rebuilding a wall dug out a broken slab of dark stone about the size of a tabletop, covered edge to edge in carved text, and the officer on the spot, whose name, Bouchard, deserves its annual moment of remembrance, saw at once what mattered, that the text was one text 3 times in 3 scripts, hieroglyphs at the top, the everyday cursive Egyptian script in the middle, and at the bottom, plain, readable, ancient Greek. The inscription itself is almost comically mundane, a decree of the priesthoods of Egypt in 196 BC recording tax concessions granted by the 13-year-old 5th Ptolemy in exchange for the usual temple honors. But no one has ever cared what the Rosetta Stone says. It mattered because the Greek could be read, and therefore the Egyptian, for the first time in 14 centuries, could in principle be reached, and the race to reach it consumed European scholarship for 20 years, an English polymath, Thomas Young, proving that the cartouches, the oval rings in the text, held the name Ptolemy spelled in sound signs, and then, in Grenoble and Paris, the strangest and most fitting figure in this whole final act, taking the problem over entirely, Jean-François Champollion, a poor bookseller's son who had been obsessed with Egypt since childhood, who is said to have resolved at age 11, on being told that no one on earth could read hieroglyphs, that he would be the one, and who had armored himself for the attempt with a dozen languages. Above all, Coptic, the language of Egypt's Christians, which he had grasped correctly and almost alone. was not merely useful but was itself the last living descendant of the language of the pharaohs, ancient Egyptian surviving in disguise in the liturgy of Egyptian churches. In September 1822, working through newly arrived copies of cartouches from Abu Simbel, Champollion found the name of Rameses, spelled by a sun sign he could read through Coptic Ra, the sun, and in a cascade of minutes the system fell open before him, sound and sense and picture interlocking exactly as he had dreamed. And he gathered his papers, ran through the streets to the institute where his brother worked, burst into the room, cried out, "I have it," and fainted dead away, remaining insensible. The story solemnly records, for 5 days, which any person who has ever finished an overwhelming piece of work will find, whatever the doctors say, entirely plausible. He recovered, published, was vindicated through fury and doubt, reached Egypt itself at last, where he walked through the temples reading the walls aloud, the first human being in 1,500 years to stand in those courts and understand them, and died at 41, worn through, having handed the human race the largest single restoration of memory it has ever received. Everything in tonight's story, understand, every named king and quoted letter and workman's excuse and love song and lament, comes through the door that man opened. And the century that followed walked through the door, finding the plundered kings of the royal cache in their cliff shaft in 1881, and then, in November 1922, in the Valley of the Kings, at the end of a final funded season, digging in the one triangle of old flood rubble never yet cleared, beneath the ruins of the very huts of the Ramside tomb workmen, an excavator named Howard Carter uncovering a cut step, and then a stair, and then a sealed doorway bearing an intact necropolis seal and a name. And we may now, at last, release the breath we left held some 3,250 years ago, because the name was Tutankhamun. Carter's patron came out from England. The stairway was cleared. A second sealed door reached, and on the 26th of November, Carter opened a small hole in its upper corner, put in a candle, and leaned to the gap, and for a long moment said nothing at all while the warm air of the 13th century BC moved past the flame, and his patron, Lord Carnarvon, unable to bear it, asked, "Can you see anything?" And Carter gave the answer that has become the motto of the entire science. Yes, wonderful things. The little tomb, protected all those centuries by its own poverty, by the flood rubble and the workmen's huts piled over its door, held very nearly everything: the chariots and the beds and the games and the walking sticks, the golden shrines nested one inside another, the solid gold inner coffin and the mask that has become the face of ancient Egypt itself, and the boy, home in his own body after all. And on the coffin, as we saw long ago, the dried wreath of cornflowers and olive and lotus. And it is recorded that the hard-bitten excavation staff, unwrapping that, went quiet, because the flowers made the time collapse. Somebody's hands, somebody's spring morning, somebody's goodbye, 3,000 years gone, and suddenly none of it gone at all. It took Carter 10 years to empty and document the tomb, and the boy king whose own dynasty chiseled him off the lists is now, by an irony that would have baffled every person in this story, the most famous pharaoh who ever lived, more famous than Khufu of the mountain, than Rameses of the 66 years, famous precisely because he was minor and forgettable and forgotten. The one grave nobody thought worth finding, and the lesson folded into that irony belongs to Mayat itself, and the Egyptians would have taken it gravely, that eternity keeps its own books, and audits late, and to a different standard than the living expect. What Egypt actually built. It is worth being honest, here at the end, in the last hour of the night, about what this longest of all national stories finally amounts to, because the honest accounting is stranger and better than the postcard version. Judged by the yardstick it set itself. Permanence. Egypt failed. The pyramids were all robbed, most within centuries of their ceiling. The hidden valley was mined to bedrock by the very community built to fill it. The temples closed, the language died. The names the whole apparatus existed to preserve went unread for 50 generations, and the last queen's last child was killed on a roadside for reasons of Roman arithmetic. Nothing the Egyptians did held the door against time, because nothing holds the door against time. And yet, judged by any other yardstick, no people in history has succeeded so absurdly, so far beyond its own wildest theology, because the Egyptians did not merely leave ruins. They left the recipe of themselves, the tax rolls and the dream books and the strike ledgers and the love poems. And when the key was found under the wall at Rosetta, the whole civilization stood up out of the sand and resumed, in the only way resumption is truly possible, in being known. The scribe of 4,000 years ago wrote, in a passage schoolboys copied until the papyrus wore out, that a man is dead only when his name is no longer spoken, that books are better than pyramids, better than tombs, because a good text keeps its maker alive in the mouth of the reader. And here is the thing I would leave with you as your thoughts loosen and drift. That claim was tested, as no other civilization's central claim has ever been tested, by 1,400 years of total silence, and it turned out to be true. Tonight, on the far side of the world, in a language that did not exist when the claim was made, you and I have spoken of Imhotep the architect, and Hatshepsut the king, and Sinuhe the homesick, and Paneb the scoundrel, and Amenecht who argued for the hungry crews at the temple gate, and Nesmeterakim, the last priest, praying for his father in the last carved line, and every time the names are said, the oldest bet in human history pays out again. They were right. Not about the mummies and not about the mountain tombs, but about the words. The river still rises, tamed now behind its dam. The black land still runs its narrow miracle through the red. The pyramids stand in their 5th millennium of mornings, and the people who watch the first of those mornings are, by their own strict definition, still alive. Because we have not stopped saying their names, and after tonight, neither have you. That brings us to the end of our story, and to the quiet hours when the temples have long since fallen silent, when the last offerings have gone cold on the last altars, and the great river runs on in the dark past monuments that have outlived every hand that raised them. The nameless farmer watching the flood arrive, the architect who stacked stone toward the sky, the woman who wore the double crown, the boy king asleep beneath the wildflowers, the bookseller's son who taught the world to read it all again. All of it has slipped quietly, gently, into the deep and settled past. If you are still awake out there, thank you for staying with me through the whole long journey down the river. There is another story waiting for you on the screen whenever you are ready for it, and it will be here when you wake. If you enjoyed this one, feel free to like and subscribe, or to leave a thought down in the comments below. But for now, there is nothing left to do, and nowhere left to be. Close your eyes and let yourself drift off to sleep. Good night and sweet dreams.